Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Gila wilderness of New Mexico, deep in the Mogollon Mountains where cell towers are just a memory, and the nearest road is a 3-day hike through terrain that doesn't forgive mistakes. Brandon Edwards and I had been planning this backcountry trip for months. We'd grown up together in Albuquerque, two kids who'd spent weekends camping in the Sandias, dreaming of bigger adventures. Now, as adults with desk jobs that were slowly suffocating our souls, we'd finally carved out 2 weeks to disappear into the largest wilderness area in New Mexico. Brandon, with his infectious laugh and tendency to quote obscure movies at inappropriate moments, had convinced me we needed to go full primitive. No GPS devices, just topographic maps and a compass like our grandfathers had done. "Think about it, Ken," he'd said, leaning back in his office chair, his brown eyes bright with excitement. "When's the last time you went somewhere truly wild, where you couldn't just call for help if things went sideways?" That should have been my first warning. We'd driven out to the Middle Fork Gila River trailhead on a crisp October morning, the aspens just beginning to turn gold against the dark pines. The parking area was empty except for a Forest Service truck and our beat-up Subaru. The ranger, a weathered woman named Sarah with eyes like flint, had looked us over with the kind of assessment that comes from decades of pulling unprepared hikers out of situations they had no business being in. "You boys sure about this route?" she'd asked, her finger tracing our planned path on the map. "This time of year, weather can turn fast up there, and that area—" She'd paused, something flickering across her expression. "Well, let's just say we don't get many people going that deep." Brandon had just grinned. "That's exactly what we're looking for." The first 2 days had been perfect. We'd followed the Middle Fork upstream, crossing the river a dozen times on moss-slicked stones, our boots squelching in the red mud of the banks. The canyon walls rose around us like cathedral pillars, striped with layers of geological time, and the only sounds were our breathing, the whisper of water over stone, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. On the second night, we'd made camp in a small meadow ringed by towering ponderosa pines, their bark smelling like vanilla in the cool air. Brandon had managed to catch a few trout from a pool downstream, and we'd cooked them over a fire that crackled and sparked with pine resin. The stars above us were so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. "This is what I'm talking about," Brandon had said, leaning back against his pack. "No emails, no traffic, no people, just us and the mountain." That was when I'd first noticed the silence. It had settled over us gradually, so subtly I'd almost missed it. The normal sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the hoot of owls, the distant yip of coyotes, had simply stopped. Even the insects had gone quiet. The fire popped and hissed, unnaturally loud in the stillness. "You hear that?" I'd asked. "What?" "Nothing. That's the problem." Brandon had cocked his head, listening. "Huh, you're right. Maybe we scared everything away with our crashing around." But I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that animals didn't just disappear. They went quiet for reasons, usually bad ones. I'd shrugged it off, told myself I was being paranoid. We'd banked the fire and crawled into our sleeping bags, and I'd eventually drifted off to the sound of Brandon's steady breathing beside me. I woke before dawn to find his sleeping bag empty. The bag was unzipped from the inside. The flaps spread wide like wings. His boots were gone, but everything else, his pack, his clothes, his jacket, remained exactly where he'd left them. No note, no sign of struggle, just gone. "Brandon," I called, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. The echo came back distorted, somehow wrong, as if the mountains were mocking me. I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed my headlamp, and began searching. The meadow showed no signs of his passage, no footprints in the dew-wet grass, no broken branches or disturbed earth. It was as if he'd simply vanished into the pre-dawn darkness. The rational part of my mind suggested he'd gotten up to relieve himself and had wandered too far from camp, maybe gotten turned around in the dark. But as I searched, calling his name until my throat was raw, a deeper fear began to take hold. This wasn't like Brandon. He was careful, methodical. He wouldn't have gone anywhere without his jacket, not with the temperature dropping into the 30s. By the time the sun crested the canyon rim, painting the rocks red and gold, I was fighting panic. I'd expanded my search to include the entire meadow and the surrounding forest, following game trails and creek beds, looking for any sign of my friend. Nothing. I was considering hiking back to the trailhead for help when I heard his voice. "Ken! Hey, Ken!" Relief flooded through me as I turned toward the sound. Brandon was walking across the meadow, emerging from a stand of aspen trees I'd already searched twice. He was wearing his boots and jeans, but no shirt or jacket, despite the morning chill that had frost forming in the shadows. "Jesus Christ, Brandon, where the hell have you been?" I jogged toward him, my relief quickly giving way to anger. "I've been searching for you for 3 hours." He stopped a few feet away, and something in his posture made me slow my approach. He was standing perfectly still, his arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. His skin was pale, almost gray in the morning light, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "I went for a walk," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. None of the warmth or humor that usually colored his words. "A walk? Brandon, it's freezing out here. Where's your shirt? Your jacket?" He looked down at his bare chest as if noticing for the first time. I was warm. There was something wrong with his eyes. They were focused on me, but there was no recognition there, no acknowledgement of my concern or anger. It was like looking at a photograph of my friend rather than the man himself. "Are you feeling okay? Did you hit your head or something?" "I'm fine." He smiled then, and my blood turned to ice water. It was Brandon's smile, the same lopsided grin I'd known since childhood, but there was nothing behind it. No warmth, no life, just the mechanical movement of facial muscles. "Brandon, we should pack up," he interrupted. "Keep moving." He walked past me toward our camp, his gait slightly off as if he were consciously thinking about each step. I followed, my mind racing. People didn't just disappear for hours and come back acting like robots. Had he fallen? Hit his head? Hypothermia could cause confusion, disorientation, but the morning wasn't that cold, and he claimed he'd been warm enough to wander around shirtless. He began packing his gear with mechanical efficiency, stuffing his sleeping bag into its compression sack with none of his usual careful attention to detail. When he reached for his shirt, I noticed dark stains on his hands, what looked like dried blood under his fingernails. "Brandon, you're bleeding. What happened to your hands?" He looked at them with the same detached curiosity he'd shown about his missing shirt. "I don't know." That was when I noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, mixing with the pine and wood smoke, but unmistakable once I focused on it. The sweet, cloying stench of something rotting, something dead. It seemed to be coming from Brandon himself, though I couldn't understand how or why. "Look, maybe we should head back," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Get you checked out by a doctor. You might have a concussion or—" "No." The word came out sharp, final. He looked at me with those empty eyes, and for just a moment, I saw something else there. Something hungry. "We keep going." I wanted to argue, but something primitive in my brain was screaming at me to be careful, to not push too hard. This wasn't Brandon. Not anymore. But if it wasn't Brandon, then what was it? We broke camp in silence. Brandon, or the thing wearing Brandon's face, shouldered his pack and began walking deeper into the wilderness, away from the trail that would take us back to civilization. I had no choice but to follow. The day passed in a surreal haze. We hiked through country that grew progressively more wild and remote, following game trails and ridgelines that barely qualified as paths. Brandon moved with tireless efficiency, never stopping to rest or check the map, as if he knew exactly where he was going. When I suggested we take a break, he simply ignored me. When I tried to start conversations about our childhood, our jobs, anything to get a normal response from him, he remained silent. The forest around us seemed to be reacting to his presence. Birds fell silent when he approached. Squirrels and chipmunks, normally chattering and active during the day, disappeared entirely. Even the flies avoided him, though the smell of decay grew stronger as the hours passed. By afternoon, I was certain of two things. This wasn't my friend, and whatever had happened to him was far worse than a simple head injury. We made camp that evening in a small clearing surrounded by dead trees. The bark had been stripped from their trunks in long, ragged gouges, as if something with claws had methodically destroyed them. Brandon, I was still thinking of it as Brandon, though I knew better, began gathering firewood with the same mechanical efficiency he'd shown all day. "I'll help," I offered, but he shook his head. "Stay here. Rest." He disappeared into the darkening forest, leaving me alone in the clearing. The silence that had followed us all day seemed to intensify, pressing against my ears like water. I checked my map and compass, trying to figure out where we were, but nothing looked familiar. According to our route plan, we should have been near Mogollon Creek, but I couldn't hear running water anywhere nearby. My GPS unit, the one I'd brought as backup despite our agreement to go primitive, showed nothing but a blank screen. The device was fully charged, but it couldn't seem to find any satellites. Even my watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 3:17. The fire. I needed to start a fire. I gathered tinder and kindling from the dead wood scattered around the clearing, arranged it in a proper fire lay, and struck my lighter. The flame caught the tinder immediately, but instead of the warm orange glow I expected, the fire burned with an unsettling blue-white light that cast everything in sickly, unnatural colors. I tried rebuilding it, using different wood, different arrangements, but the result was always the same. That cold, wrong light that made my skin crawl. Brandon returned as full darkness fell, dragging an armload of wood behind him. In the blue firelight, his skin looked corpse pale, and when he smiled at me, I saw that his teeth were stained dark. "Good fire," he said, settling down across from me. The wood he'd brought was different from what I'd seen in the forest. Pale and smooth, almost white. As he fed it to the flames, I caught glimpses of what looked like joints, like bone. "Brandon, we need to talk about what happened to you. This morning, when you disappeared. I told you I went for a walk. For 6 hours, in the dark, without any clothes." He stared at me across the fire, and in the dancing light, his face seemed to shift and change. Sometimes it was Brandon, familiar and beloved. Other times it was something else entirely. Gaunt, predatory, ancient. "I needed to feed," he said quietly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. My breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and the fire, that horrible blue fire, dimmed to barely visible flames. Feed on what? His smile widened, and I saw that what I'd taken for stains on his teeth were actually gaps where several molars should have been. In their place were elongated canines, sharp as broken glass. "There was a deer," he said, "a young doe. She was drinking from the creek." As he spoke, his voice began to change. The familiar cadences of my childhood friend faded, replaced by something else. Something that sounded like wind through empty spaces, like the whisper of autumn leaves across stone. She was so beautiful in the moonlight, so trusting. She didn't run when I approached, not until I was close enough to touch her. I wanted to run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to grab my pack and bolt into the darkness. But where could I go? I was lost in hundreds of thousands of acres of wilderness with no working GPS and a companion who was clearly no longer human. "What did you do to Brandon?" I whispered. The thing wearing my friend's face tilted its head, considering the question. Brandon wanted to disappear, didn't he? To get away from everything. To be free. Its voice was getting harder to understand, the words blurring together like static. I simply granted his wish. Where is he? He's here. Can't you see him? It gestured to its own body with those blood-stained hands. Every memory, every thought, every fear, all of it preserved inside me. Would you like to say hello? For just a moment, Brandon's face reasserted itself. His real face, full of terror and pain, his mouth moving in a soundless scream before the thing suppressed him again. I was on my feet before I realized I'd moved, my hand closing around the handle of my hiking knife. The thing that had been Brandon didn't seem concerned by my weapon. If anything, it looked amused. Iron won't help you, Kenneth. This body is still mostly human, mostly alive. If you hurt it, you hurt him too. It was right, and we both knew it. Whatever this creature was, it had wrapped itself around my friend like a parasite, using his flesh as camouflage. Killing it might mean killing Brandon too, if there was anything left of him to save. What do you want? I asked. To feed, to grow strong, to spread. It stood, and I saw that it had grown taller somehow, its limbs elongated in ways that shouldn't have been possible. This wilderness is perfect for my kind. So much space, so many places to hide, and so many lost souls looking to disappear. The fire guttered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. In the sudden blackness, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of joints popping and bones cracking as if the thing was reshaping itself. "Run!" Brandon's voice whispered from somewhere in the dark. The real Brandon, fighting through whatever held him. "Ken, for God's sake, run!" I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my pack and headlamp and sprinted into the forest, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches, not caring about the noise I was making or the direction I was heading. Behind me, something howled, a sound no human throat could produce, full of hunger and rage and terrible intelligence. The beam of my headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating twisted tree trunks and patches of dead undergrowth. Everything looked wrong, distorted, as if the forest itself was diseased. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, tasting of copper and decay. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, then kept running. Every shadow seemed to hide a predator, every sound made me flinch. When I finally stopped, gasping and shaking, I realized I could no longer hear the thing pursuing me. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. I found a large pine tree with low-hanging branches and climbed as high as I dared, using my headlamp to check for any sign of pursuit. The forest below was a maze of shadows and suggestions, shapes that might have been rocks or logs or something much worse. Hours passed. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, real or imagined. Sometime before dawn, I heard Brandon calling my name. "Ken! Ken, where are you? I got away from it. I need help." His voice sounded normal again, full of pain and fear and desperate hope, but I'd learned not to trust appearances. I stayed in my tree, silent and hidden, while the voice moved through the forest below. "Please, Ken. I'm hurt. I think my leg is broken. I can't make it back on my own." The pleading went on for what felt like hours, growing more and more desperate. At one point, the voice broke into sobs, huge, racking sounds of grief and terror that made my heart ache. It was such a perfect imitation of my friend in distress that I almost climbed down to help him. Almost. But there was something wrong with the acoustics. The voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the speaker was moving with impossible speed. And underneath Brandon's familiar tones, I could hear something else. A wet, sliding sound like something being dragged across stone. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy, the calling stopped. In the growing light, I could see the forest floor below, covered in a thick carpet of dead leaves and fallen branches. And there, directly beneath my tree, were tracks. They started as human footprints, Brandon's size 11 hiking boots, the familiar wear pattern from his pronated gait. But as they circled the tree, they began to change. The prints grew longer, deeper, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. By the time they completed their circuit and disappeared back into the forest, they were no longer human at all. I waited until full daylight before climbing down, and even then I moved with extreme caution. My map and compass were still useless. The needle spun wildly no matter which direction I faced. But the sun was rising in the east, and I knew that if I could find running water, I could follow it downstream until it joined a larger creek, then a river, and eventually back to civilization. The problem was finding water. In my panicked flight, I'd lost track of the creek we'd been following, and now every direction looked the same. Endless pine forest broken by rocky outcroppings and small meadows filled with dead grass. I chose a direction and started walking, stopping frequently to listen for the sound of water. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, but now I was grateful for the silence. It meant the thing wasn't immediately nearby. After several hours of hiking, I finally heard it. The faint whisper of water over stone. I followed the sound and found a small creek winding through a narrow canyon. The water was crystal clear, cold enough to make my teeth ache when I drank. It tasted clean and normal, the first normal thing I'd encountered since Brandon's disappearance. I followed the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me back to familiar territory. The walls of the canyon rose on either side, striped with red and white stone that reminded me of the formations near the Gila cliff dwellings. If I was right, I might be closer to the main trail system than I'd thought. The sun was setting when I saw the smoke. It was rising from a narrow side canyon, a thin gray column against the darkening sky. Someone had a campfire. Other hikers maybe, or hunters, people who could help me get out of this nightmare. I left the creek and climbed toward the source of the smoke, my heart lifting for the first time in 2 days. As I got closer, I could smell wood smoke and something else, something cooking. My stomach growled in response, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. I found the camp in a small clearing carved into the canyon wall. There was a fire burning in a ring of stones, with something roasting on a makeshift spit above it. A single figure sat beside the fire, silhouetted against the flames. "Hello," I called, not wanting to startle whoever it was. "I'm a hiker, I'm lost, and I need help." The figure turned toward me and my relief died in my throat. It was Brandon, or something wearing Brandon's face anyway, but this version was wrong in new and terrible ways. His skin was pale as moonlight, stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp and angular. His mouth was too wide, splitting his face nearly from ear to ear, and when he smiled, I saw row after row of needle-sharp teeth. "Kenneth," he said, his voice a wet whisper. "I've been waiting for you." I backed away, but something grabbed me from behind. Arms that were too long and too strong, smelling of rot and old blood. Another Brandon, this one even more distorted than the first, its eyes black holes in a face that was melting like wax. "We've been so hungry," the first one said, turning the spit so I could see what was cooking. It was a human leg, still wearing a hiking boot, Brandon's hiking boot. "But now we can feast properly." There were more of them in the shadows around the fire, dozens of Brandon things, each one a slightly different variation on the same theme. Some were missing limbs, others had extra ones. All of them were staring at me with that terrible, empty hunger. "You see," the original said, standing and walking toward me, "your friend was special. So much fear, so much guilt, so much delicious trauma. When I consumed him, I consumed all of that. And now I can be him forever, in all the ways he might have been." The arms holding me tightened, and I felt claws digging into my flesh through my jacket. My knife was still on my belt, but I couldn't reach it with my arms pinned. "Don't worry," Brandon's voice whispered in my ear. "We'll keep you alive for a long time. Fear makes the meat so much more tender. That's when I remembered the flare gun. It was a last resort signal device, something I'd packed on a whim and forgotten about until now. It was in the side pocket of my pack, clipped to my belt within reach of my left hand if I could just shift my weight. The Brandon holding me was focused on the others, all of them discussing how to prepare me for their meal. I managed to work my hand into the pocket and found the flare gun's grip. The safety was already off. I'd checked it before we left, part of my obsessive gear-checking ritual that Brandon always made fun of. I pulled the trigger. The flare burst from the gun like a tiny meteor streaking across the clearing in a brilliant red arc. It struck the original Brandon in the chest, and he erupted into flames that burned with the same sickly blue color as our campfire the night before. The thing holding me shrieked and released me, clutching at its own chest as sympathetic flames began to spread across its body. All of the Brandon things were burning now, connected by whatever dark magic had created them. They writhed and howled, their shapes shifting and melting, revealing glimpses of what they really were underneath the stolen flesh. I didn't wait to see what that might be. I grabbed my pack and ran. Behind me, the clearing exploded into an inferno of blue fire and inhuman screaming. I felt the heat on my back as I scrambled up the canyon wall, using roots and rock ledges to pull myself to safety. When I finally reached the rim and looked back, the entire canyon was filled with flame, and something vast and dark was rising from the fire, something with too many teeth and eyes like black stars. I ran through the night, following the creek by feel and instinct, too terrified to use my headlamp in case it drew attention. When dawn finally came, I found myself at a familiar-looking confluence where two streams joined to form a larger creek. According to my now-functioning GPS, I was less than 5 miles from the nearest forest road. It took me another day to reach civilization. When the Forest Service truck found me stumbling along the dirt road, delirious from exhaustion and dehydration, I tried to tell them about Brandon, about the things in the forest. They found our original campsite easily enough, the meadow with the dead trees and the cold ashes of our last normal fire. They never found Brandon's body. The official report said he'd become disoriented and wandered off a cliff. They found some torn clothing and bloodstains on the rocks below, enough to close the case. I didn't contradict their findings. Who would believe the truth? But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the mountains, I hear his voice calling my name, and sometimes in the reflection of my bathroom mirror, I catch glimpses of that too wide smile and those black, hungry eyes. The doctors say it's trauma, post-traumatic stress from losing my best friend in such a horrible way. They've given me pills and therapy and all the modern tools for healing a broken mind. What they don't understand is that I'm not broken. I'm changed. The thing that took Brandon didn't just consume him, it marked me too. I can feel it sometimes, like a splinter working its way deeper into my soul, a whisper in the dark parts of my mind, promising that if I just let go, if I stop fighting, the hunger will finally make sense. I keep the flare gun on my nightstand now, loaded and ready. Not because I think it will help if the Wendigo comes for me. I know now what I was really fighting in that canyon, what ancient hunger had awakened in the Gila wilderness. The fire only scattered it, didn't destroy it. It's still out there, wearing Brandon's face, or maybe someone else's by now. No, I keep the flare gun for when I finally lose the battle against the whispers in my head, for when I feel my own face beginning to change, my own teeth growing sharp and hungry, because I won't become what took my friend. I won't let the Wendigo win, not while there's still enough of Kenneth Young left to pull the trigger. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Gila wilderness of New Mexico, near the Mogollon Mountains, during what was supposed to be a simple corporate team-building retreat. I worked for a mid-sized insurance company in Albuquerque, and our boss, Janet Reed, thought it would be brilliant to drag the entire claims department into the middle of nowhere for 3 days of outdoor bonding. The irony wasn't lost on me that we spent our days calculating risks for a living, yet here we were, willingly walking into one of the most remote wilderness areas in the continental United States. There were 6 of us total. Janet, our department head, was a woman in her 50s who approached everything with military precision despite never having served. She'd planned this trip down to the last protein bar. Then there was Michael Williams, the office kiss-ass who volunteered for everything hoping for a promotion that would never come. Sandra Lewis, our newest hire, barely 25 and still optimistic about corporate life. Thomas Davis, the quiet guy who kept to himself but knew more about outdoor survival than the rest of us combined. And finally, Amanda Wright, who'd been with the company longer than anyone and had the bitter edge to prove it. We'd driven out in 2 vehicles, leaving civilization behind as we headed deeper into the Catron County wilderness. The Gila is unforgiving territory. Over 3 million acres of rugged mountains, deep canyons, and dense forests where cell service is a fairy tale and the nearest hospital might as well be on another planet. Janet had chosen a spot near the west fork of the Gila River, about 15 miles from the nearest maintained trail. The first day passed without incident. We set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, the air thin and crisp at nearly 7,000 feet elevation. The silence was oppressive. No traffic, no machinery, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant murmur of the river. For someone accustomed to the constant hum of city life, the quiet felt almost alive, pressing against your eardrums like a physical presence. That first night, gathered around our campfire, we played the usual corporate bonding games. Janet had brought a deck of cards and some team-building exercises that felt ridiculous under the vast canopy of stars. But the beer helped, and for a few hours, we almost felt like friends instead of co-workers thrown together by circumstance. It was Sandra who first noticed something was off. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked around midnight, just as we were preparing to turn in for the night. We all stopped talking, straining to listen. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Nothing unusual. "Hear what?" Michael asked. It sounded like whistling, coming from the trees. Thomas looked up from the coals he'd been banking. "Could be wind through the rocks. These canyons create weird acoustics." But I'd heard it too, a low melodic sound that didn't quite match any natural phenomenon I knew. It had an almost human quality, like someone whistling a tune just outside the range of clear hearing. "Probably just settling in for the night," Amanda said dismissively. "Everything sounds different out here." We went to our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. The darkness beyond our campfire was absolute, the kind of black that swallows light and makes you question whether your eyes are even open. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the subtle sounds of the wilderness, the rustle of small animals, the creak of trees, and underneath it all, that faint whistling that seemed to circle our camp like a predator testing our defenses. Morning brought relief and embarrassment. In daylight, our fears seemed foolish. The forest was beautiful, peaceful even. Birds chirped in the canopy above, and the river sang its eternal song over smooth stones. Janet had us up early for a group hike to some nearby hot springs she'd marked on her topographical map. The trail was barely visible, more of a game path than anything meant for human travel. We walked single file, with Thomas leading and Janet bringing up the rear, constantly checking her GPS and compass. The device had been acting strangely since we'd arrived, sometimes losing signal entirely despite having a clear view of the sky. "Technology," Thomas muttered when Janet complained about the GPS for the 3rd time. "Out here, you're better off trusting your instincts." The hot springs were worth the hike, natural pools carved into the rock, fed by mineral-rich water that steamed in the cool mountain air. We spent the afternoon soaking and relaxing, and for a while, I forgot about the strange sounds from the night before. But as evening approached and we made our way back to camp, the forest began to feel different. The shadows stretched longer, deeper, and the temperature dropped with shocking suddenness. More troubling was the silence. The bird songs had stopped, and even the ever-present sound of insects had faded to nothing. "Where's the fire?" Sandra asked as we crested the small ridge overlooking our campsite. Our carefully banked coals should have still been glowing, but the fire pit was dark. More concerning, our camp looked wrong. The tents were still standing, but they seemed slightly out of place, as if someone had moved them a few inches while trying to put them back exactly where they'd found them. "Did we pack everything this morning?" Michael asked, staring at his backpack, which was leaning against a tree. He was certain he'd left it nowhere near. Thomas was already examining the fire pit, stirring the cold ashes with a stick. "This has been out for hours. Those coals should have lasted all day." Janet pulled out her checklist. She had a checklist for everything, and began inventorying our supplies. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. Food packages had been refolded slightly differently. Sleeping bags had been moved and replaced. Someone, or something, had gone through our camp with careful, almost respectful thoroughness. "Animals," Amanda said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe bears." "Bears don't fold things," Thomas replied grimly. We rebuilt the fire as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, plunging our little clearing into premature darkness. The flames seemed to struggle against some invisible force, fluttering and dimming randomly despite the absence of wind. When we tried to cook dinner, the food had an off taste, as if the canned goods had somehow spoiled during the day despite being sealed. The whistling started again just after full dark, but this time it was closer, more distinct. The melody was haunting and somehow familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. It seemed to come from different directions. First from the trees to our east, then from across the river, then from somewhere directly above us in the canopy. "That's not wind," Sandra said, her voice tight with fear. We huddled closer to the fire, backs to each other, watching the tree line. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the firelight, creating shapes that looked almost human before dissolving back into formless darkness. "Someone's out there," Michael whispered. "Someone's watching us." Thomas had pulled out a heavy flashlight and was scanning the perimeter of our camp. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, creating a cone of light that somehow made the surrounding blackness seem even more impenetrable. "Hello," Janet called out, her voice echoing strangely in the thin air. "Is someone there?" The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. Then, from somewhere impossibly far away yet somehow right beside us, came a sound that raised every hair on my body. A child's laughter, high and sweet and utterly wrong in this place of ancient trees and predatory darkness. None of us slept that second night. We kept the fire burning high and took turns on watch, though what we were watching for, none of us could say. The laughter came again twice more before dawn, each time from a different direction, each time sending ice through our veins. When morning finally arrived, we found fresh tracks around our camp. They were human footprints, but wrong. The toes were too long and there were too many of them, as if someone had extra digits. The prints circled our tents in a perfect spiral, getting closer with each revolution until they stopped just outside the ring of light our fire had cast. "We're leaving," Janet announced, and for once no one argued with her decision. But as we broke camp, Sandra made a discovery that changed everything. Her hiking boots were missing. She'd left them outside her tent the night before. Everyone did, it was normal camping practice. But now they were gone. In their place were her boots' exact duplicates, but wrong in subtle ways. The laces were different colors, the tread pattern was reversed, and they were 2 sizes too large. "These aren't mine," she said, holding up the imposter boots. "These aren't mine, but they look exactly like mine." Thomas examined them closely, his face growing pale. "The wear patterns are wrong too. Look, your right foot supinates slightly when you walk. These show the opposite wear pattern, like they belong to your mirror image." We searched the entire camp but found no trace of Sandra's original boots. It was as if they had been surgically removed from reality and replaced with these unsettling duplicates. "This is some kind of sick joke," Michael said, but his voice was shaky. "Someone's messing with us." Janet tried to maintain control, but I could see the fear creeping into her military composure. "We stick together. No one goes anywhere alone. We hike out to the main trail and get to the vehicles." But when we tried to leave, we discovered our first real problem. The forest had changed during the night. The path we'd taken to the hot springs was gone, replaced by a rocky slope that none of us remembered. Janet's GPS was completely dead, not just out of signal but actually non-functional, its screen showing only static. Her compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Which way is the river?" Thomas asked. We listened, but the sound of running water that had been constant since our arrival was gone. The silence was broken only by our own breathing and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. "It was right there." Sandra pointed toward what should have been the river valley. Instead, we saw only more forest stretching endlessly into the distance. We were lost. Worse than lost, we were displaced, as if the landscape itself had been rearranged during the night. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by terrain that looked similar but wrong, like a photograph that had been slightly blurred and then refocused. "We need more firewood," Thomas said after we'd spent an hour trying to find any recognizable feature. "If we're stuck here another night, we'll need to keep a fire going." I volunteered to go with him, partly out of genuine helpfulness, but mostly because the thought of sitting idle in our displaced camp made my skin crawl. Janet insisted we stay within sight of each other and return within an hour. The forest felt different away from our camp. The trees seemed taller, older, and the spaces between them were filled with a greenish twilight that persisted despite the bright sun above the canopy. We found plenty of dead wood, but it felt wrong in our hands. Too light, too brittle, as if it had been desiccated by something other than time and weather. That's when we heard the scream. It came from the direction of our camp, a high, piercing shriek that cut through the forest silence like a blade. Thomas and I dropped our wood and ran, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with desperate urgency. We found the others standing in a tight circle, staring at something on the ground. Sandra was sitting on a log, shaking violently, while Michael and Amanda flanked her protectively. Janet was kneeling beside what looked like a pile of shredded fabric. "What happened?" Thomas demanded. "Something took her," Sandra whispered. "Something came out of the trees and took her." But that made no sense. Sandra was right there, clearly upset but unharmed. I looked around our group, counting. Janet, Michael, Amanda, Thomas, Sandra, and me. 6 people, all accounted for. "Who got taken?" I asked. Sandra looked up at me with eyes wide with terror. "Me," she said. "It took me." The pile of fabric was Sandra's clothes, the exact outfit she'd been wearing moments before. Her hiking shirt, her pants, even her underwear, all shredded as if by claws and covered in a substance that might have been blood but smelled like copper and ozone. "I was sitting right here," Sandra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I saw myself walk out of the trees. She looked exactly like me, but her eyes were wrong. All black, like a shark's eyes, and she smiled at me with too many teeth." "Sandra, you're not making sense," Amanda said gently. "You're here. You're fine." "No." Sandra jumped up, backing away from us. "You don't understand. She killed me. I watched her kill me. I watched her tear me apart, and then she put on my skin like a coat." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of our own rapid breathing. I found myself looking at Sandra, really looking at her, for the first time since we'd returned. She looked normal, completely normal, but there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a wildness, like a trapped animal. "Sandra," Janet said carefully, "what are you wearing right now?" Sandra looked down at herself and screamed again. She was wearing the exact outfit that lay in shreds at our feet, identical down to a small coffee stain on the front of her shirt that she'd gotten that morning. "This isn't real," Michael said. This can't be real. But Thomas was examining the torn clothes and his face had gone white. "There's tissue here," he said quietly. "Human tissue." The smell hit us then. Not just copper and ozone, but something organic and awful, like meat left too long in the sun. And underneath that, something else. Something that smelled like wilderness and predation and intelligence older than human civilization. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now. We grab what we can and we start walking." "Which way?" Janet asked desperately. "We don't know which way leads out." That's when Sandra, if it was Sandra, began to laugh. It started low and quiet, but quickly built to the same childlike giggling we'd heard during the night. As she laughed, her mouth seemed to stretch wider than any human mouth should, revealing not teeth, but rows of sharp, yellowed fangs. "You can't leave," she said, and her voice was wrong now, layered with harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "This is where you belong now. This is where you've always belonged." Thomas was the first to run. He grabbed his pack and sprinted toward the trees, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal. The thing wearing Sandra's shape watched him go with amused interest. "Tommy always was the smart one," it said conversationally. "He understands what's happening here." "What are you?" Janet demanded, though her voice shook as she asked. The Sandra thing tilted its head with bird-like curiosity. "I am what walks between the spaces. What lives in the gaps where your maps have no meaning. You have entered my territory, and now you belong to it. To me." It began to change as it spoke. Sandra's familiar features flowed like water, revealing something underneath that human minds weren't designed to process. The skin rippled and stretched, showing glimpses of fur and scales and things that had no name. The eyes went completely black as Sandra had described, but worse. They seemed to extend infinitely inward, like looking into the space between stars. Michael broke next, making a desperate lunge for his pack. The thing that had been Sandra moved with impossible speed, covering the distance between them in a single fluid motion. I heard bones break as it caught him, and Michael's scream was cut short with a wet, tearing sound. Amanda and Janet ran in opposite directions, leaving me alone with the creature and whatever was left of Michael. The woods swallowed their screams within seconds, as if the forest itself was hungry for the sound of human terror. I should have run, too. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I found myself frozen, staring at the thing as it crouched over Michael's body. It was still wearing pieces of Sandra's appearance, her hair, parts of her face, but the illusion was breaking down, revealing something that belonged to nightmares and ancient folklore. "You're a skinwalker," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. It looked up from its feeding, tilting its head again. "That's one of your words for us. We prefer older names, names that existed before your kind learned to speak. What do you want? To hunt, to feed, to wear your shapes and walk among your kind when the mood strikes me." It smiled with Sandra's mouth, but the teeth were all wrong. "Your friend will make a fine skin when I'm finished with this one." The casual way it spoke of wearing human beings like clothing made my stomach revolt. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might trigger its predatory instincts. "Don't run, Robert," it said, and hearing my name in Sandra's voice was like ice water in my veins. "You won't get far. This place belongs to me now. Distance has no meaning here. Direction is what I choose it to be." That's when I understood what had happened to our camp, to the missing river, to the changed landscape. This creature didn't just hunt in the wilderness. It controlled it, reshaping reality within its territory to trap and disorient its prey. "The others will die," it continued conversationally. "They'll run until their hearts burst, or until the forest itself claims them. But you interest me. You haven't run." "Why?" I didn't have a good answer. Terror had paralyzed me beyond rational thought, but there was something else, a growing certainty that running would only prolong the inevitable. In its territory, by its rules, we were all already dead. "Smart boy," it said, reading my expression. "Yes, you understand. This is not a chase. This is a harvest." It finished with Michael and stood, wiping blood from Sandra's borrowed lips. As it moved, I caught glimpses of its true form, something that was part animal, part nightmare, part ancient intelligence that had learned to hate humanity through centuries of bitter conflict. "Tell me about Sandra," I said desperately, hoping to buy time, though I had no plan for using it. "The real Sandra. What happened to her?" "She screamed beautifully," it replied, and when I peeled away her skin, she was still screaming. "Your kind makes such wonderful sounds when you finally understand what you truly are. Meat and fear wrapped in a thin shell of delusion." It was advancing toward me now, moving with predatory grace. Sandra's familiar features continued to shift and blur, like a television with poor reception. I could smell it now, wilderness and death and something organic that made my hindbrain gibber with terror. That's when I heard the gunshot. The sound echoed through the forest, sharp and definitively human. The creature stopped mid-stride, its head snapping toward the source with animal alertness. "Tommy," it said, and for the first time I heard annoyance in its voice. Clever Tommy brought protection. Another gunshot, closer this time, followed by Thomas's voice shouting from somewhere in the trees. "Robert, if you can hear me, stay away from Sandra. That's not Sandra." The skinwalker snarled, a sound no human throat could produce. "Your friend thinks metal and powder can stop what I am. He'll learn differently." It turned toward the sound of Thomas's voice and began to change more dramatically. Sandra's shape flowed away like water, revealing something that looked like a wolf but walked upright, with hands instead of paws and intelligence burning in its two human eyes. "Run," it said to me over its shoulder. "Give me sport. I'll find you when I'm finished with the hunter." Then it was gone, disappearing into the forest with impossible silence. I stood alone in our ruined camp, surrounded by the scattered remains of Michael and the shredded clothes that had once belonged to Sandra. I ran. The forest blurred past me as I crashed through underbrush and leaped over fallen logs. Behind me, I could hear gunshots echoing among the trees, followed by sounds that had no place in the natural world. Howls and screams and the crash of something large moving through the forest at incredible speed. The terrain shifted around me as I ran, paths appearing and disappearing according to some malevolent intelligence. I would find myself running downhill only to discover I was somehow moving upward. Familiar landmarks would appear and then transform into something alien and wrong when I tried to approach them. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed as fluid as distance in that cursed place. The sun remained fixed in the sky, creating a perpetual late afternoon that never progressed toward evening. My watch had stopped working, its hands frozen at 3:47, though whether AM or PM I couldn't say. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I found myself in a small clearing that looked exactly like our original campsite, complete with the circle of stones we'd arranged for our fire pit. But the stones were different colors, and the trees surrounding the clearing were species that didn't grow in New Mexico. I sat on a fallen log to catch my breath and immediately regretted it. The log was warm, pulsing like a living thing. And when I looked more closely, I could see what appeared to be a human rib cage partially embedded in the wood. "Getting tired, Robert?" I spun around to find Sandra standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked completely normal again, unmarked by the violence I'd witnessed. Even her clothes were intact, showing no trace of the bloody tatters we'd found at our camp. "You're not Sandra," I said. "Of course I am." She smiled, and this time the teeth were human. "I'm your co-worker, your friend. Don't you recognize me? I watched you kill Michael." "Did you? That seems unlikely. Michael's right here with me." She stepped aside, and Michael emerged from behind a tree. He looked normal too, completely uninjured, though there was something empty in his eyes, like looking at a mannequin dressed in human clothes. "Hey, Bob," Michael said, using a nickname only he ever called me. "We've been looking for you. Everyone's worried." "Where are the others?" "Safe," Sandra said. "Thomas found a way out. Janet and Amanda are already back at the vehicles. We just need to collect you and we can all go home." They moved closer, and I found myself backing toward the center of the clearing. Everything they said sounded reasonable, logical, exactly what I wanted to hear, but their eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep, like looking into wells that had no bottom. "Come on, Bob," Michael said. "Let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." "Where's the trail?" I asked. Sandra pointed toward a gap in the trees that definitely hadn't been there moments before. "Right through there. 20 minutes. 20. And we'll be back at the trucks." I knew it was a trap. Every rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but the alternative was staying lost in this nightmarish wilderness forever. And they looked so normal, so human. If not for what I'd witnessed, I might have believed them. "Okay," I said. "Lead the way." Sandra's smile widened slightly. Not enough to seem inhuman, but enough to make my skin crawl. She and Michael turned toward the supposed trail, and I followed, every step taking me deeper into whatever web the skinwalker had woven. The path was clear and well-maintained, nothing like the game trails we'd been following since our arrival. It led steadily downward through familiar-looking forest, and after about 10 minutes I could hear the sound of running water. Our missing river returned as if it had never vanished. "See?" Sandra said over her shoulder. "I told you it wasn't far." But as we walked, I began to notice details that didn't fit. The trees were the right species but the wrong sizes. Some too large, others too small, as if they'd been arranged by someone who'd studied forest ecology but had never actually seen a real wilderness. Bird songs echoed from empty branches, and the shadows fell at impossible angles despite the fixed position of the sun. "Sandra," I said carefully, "what's your middle name?" She turned around, her expression puzzled. "What an odd question. Why do you want to know?" "We've worked together for 3 years. I should know your middle name." "It's—" She paused, her face cycling through expressions like a computer searching for the right file. "Elizabeth. Sandra Elizabeth Lewis." But I knew Sandra's middle name was Marie. She'd mentioned it during a birthday celebration just 2 months ago when someone had confused her with another Sandra in the accounting department. "And Michael," I continued, "what's your wife's name?" Michael turned around, and for just a moment his face was completely blank. Not confused, not thoughtful, but empty, like a TV screen between channels. "Sarah," he said finally. "Her name is Sarah." Michael wasn't married. He'd been single for as long as I'd known him, a fact he complained about regularly during office happy hours. I stopped walking. "You're not my friends." The things wearing their faces stopped too, turning to face me with synchronized movements that no humans would ever make. Their expressions shifted, the friendly masks slipping away to reveal predatory hunger underneath. "Clever, Robert," Sandra Thing said, "but not clever enough." They began to change, their borrowed faces flowing like melted wax. What emerged wasn't the wolf creature I'd seen before, but something worse, an amalgamation of human and animal features arranged in ways that hurt to look at. Arms that bent too many ways, faces that multiplied and merged, teeth and claws and eyes in configurations that challenged sanity. "We are what your kind fears in the deep places," it said with voices that harmonized with themselves. "We are the hunger that waits between the trees, and you have wandered into our garden." I ran again, but this time there was nowhere to go. The path behind me had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of thorns that reached impossibly high into the canopy. To either side, the forest had become a maze of twisted branches and grasping roots that moved with malevolent purpose. The only way was forward, deeper into whatever trap they'd prepared. The creatures followed at a leisurely pace, no longer bothering to maintain their human disguises. They spoke to each other in sounds that might have been language, or might have been the forest itself expressing its hunger for human flesh. The path led to a clearing that was definitely not natural. The trees formed a perfect circle, their branches intertwining overhead like the ribs of some vast cathedral. In the center stood a structure that hurt to look at directly, something that might have been a cabin but was built from materials that didn't quite obey the laws of physics. "Welcome home, Robert," one of the creatures said. That's when I saw them, Thomas, Janet, and Amanda, sitting around a campfire that cast no heat and produced smoke that fell instead of rising. They looked up as I entered the clearing, their faces lighting up with expressions of relief and joy. "Robert," Janet called out, "thank God you're safe. We thought we'd lost you." But their eyes were all wrong, black and empty like the depths of space, and when they smiled I could see that their teeth had been filed to points. "Come sit with us," Amanda said, patting the ground beside her. "We've been waiting for you." "The fire is so warm," Thomas added, though the flames were clearly cold. "And we have plenty of food." They gestured toward what they claimed was food, hunks of meat roasting on spits over the fire. The smell was terrible, sweet and rotten, and I could see fragments of fabric and what might have been buttons mixed in with the charred flesh. "That's not food," I said. "Of course it is," Janet replied reasonably. "It's Sandra and Michael. They volunteered to feed us. They understand what we are now, what we've all become." The creatures that had led me here took their places around the fire, their forms shifting constantly between human and something else. They watched me with patient hunger, like cats observing a mouse they'd cornered. "Sit, Robert," one of them said with Thomas's voice. "Join your friends. Become what you were always meant to be." "What's that?" "Food. All humans are food, eventually. We're just helping you understand your true purpose." I backed toward the edge of the clearing, but the trees had closed ranks behind me. The branches intertwined so tightly that squeezing through would be impossible, and they rustled with awareness, as if the forest itself was alive and hungry. "There's nowhere to go," the Janet thing said gently. "This is your home now, forever." That's when I noticed the bones. They were partially buried in the soft earth around the clearing. Human bones, weathered by time and gnawed by teeth that were definitely not animal. Some still had scraps of clothing attached, modern synthetic fabrics mixed with older materials that might have been cotton or wool. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Since the beginning," Amanda Thing replied. "Since the first humans wandered into our territory and learned what real hunger means. We've been collecting visitors for generations, adding them to our family." "Some fight," Thomas Thing added conversationally. "Others try to run. A few even try to reason with us, as if logic could penetrate appetite. But they all end up the same way, around our fire, keeping us company on cold nights." The fire flared higher, and in the flames I could see faces. Human faces twisted in eternal agony, their mouths open in screams that produced no sound. Sandra's face was among them, and Michael's, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. "Don't worry," the creature wearing Janet's shape said kindly. "It doesn't hurt for long, and afterwards you'll understand. You'll see how beautiful this is, how pure. No more worries about mortgages or careers or human relationships, just the eternal moment of being consumed." They were all standing now, forming a circle around me. In the firelight, their true forms were becoming more visible, things that had learned to walk upright and speak human words, but had never quite mastered the art of appearing fully human. Their proportions were wrong, their movements too fluid, their eyes too knowing. "Last chance, Robert," one of them said. "You can join willingly, or we can make you join, but you will join us. There is no third option in our garden." That's when I heard the explosion. It came from somewhere outside the clearing, a thunderous crack that shook the ground and sent birds screaming from the canopy. The creatures' heads snapped toward the sound, their predatory attention momentarily diverted. Another explosion, closer this time, followed by the smell of real fire. Not the cold flames of their supernatural campfire, but honest combustion that consumed wood and grass and anything else it could reach. "What is that?" the Sandra thing snarled. A third explosion answered her question. Thomas came crashing through the tree line, but not the twisted version that had been sitting by their fire. This was the real Thomas, covered in dirt and blood, carrying a hunting rifle in one hand and what looked like a bundle of dynamite in the other. "You want to hunt?" he shouted at the creatures. "Let's fucking hunt!" He threw the dynamite into their supernatural fire, and the clearing erupted in light and sound and genuine heat. The creatures shrieked, not with human voices but with sounds like breaking glass and tearing metal. Their false forms dissolved entirely, revealing things that belonged in nightmares. "Robert, move!" Thomas grabbed my arm and hauled me toward the gap he'd blown in the tree line. "This won't hold them long." We ran through a forest that was burning now with real fire, not the cold illusions the skinwalkers had woven. Behind us, inhuman screams echoed through the night as their carefully constructed trap dissolved into chaos. "How?" I gasped as we ran. "Mining engineering degree," Thomas replied grimly. "And my grandfather's stories about things that live in the deep places. Sometimes the old ways work better than GPS and cell phones." The explosions had broken whatever hold the creatures had over the local geography. The forest was returning to its natural configuration, and in the distance I could see electric lights, the parking area where we'd left our vehicles 3 days ago. We reached the trucks just as dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks. Thomas had the keys to his pickup and we threw ourselves inside, locking the doors as if metal and glass could protect us from what we'd faced. "The others?" I asked. "Dead," Thomas said simply. "All of them. I found their remains in caves about a mile from where we camped. Some were recent, some were old, very old. That thing has been hunting in these mountains for a long time." We drove in silence for the first hour, putting distance between ourselves and the Gila wilderness. Only when we reached the first gas station did I feel like I could breathe again. "What do we tell people?" I asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the normal, everyday scene of people pumping gas and buying snacks. "Hiking accident," he said finally. "Got separated in a storm. Couldn't find the others. Happens more often than you'd think in wilderness areas." And the truth? The truth is that there are things in the deep places that human beings weren't meant to encounter. Things that have been there since before we learned to walk upright. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, you stumble into their territory. I never went camping again, never even went hiking in areas that weren't well populated and thoroughly mapped. But sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I wake up with the taste of copper and ozone in my mouth, and I remember the sound of Sandra's voice asking why I looked so frightened. The official report listed Janet, Sandra, Michael, and Amanda as missing hikers, presumed dead due to exposure and adverse weather conditions. Their bodies were never found, though search teams combed the Gila wilderness for weeks. Thomas and I never spoke about what really happened. We couldn't. Who would believe us? But sometimes I catch him staring at security cameras in the office or checking locks twice before leaving for the day. He knows, like I know, that the things we encountered didn't die in that fire. They're still out there, in the spaces between the maps, wearing faces they've stolen and waiting for the next group of hikers to wander into their territory. Still hunting. Still hungry. And sometimes, late at night when the office is empty and I'm working overtime, I hear whistling in the corridors, a familiar melody that sounds almost like a lullaby, coming from someone just out of sight around the next corner. When that happens, I pack up immediately and leave, because I know that some hunts never really end. They just move to new hunting grounds. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Gila wilderness of New Mexico in October of last year. I'm writing this down because the doctors say it might help with what they call my severe psychological trauma, but mostly because I need people to know what's really out there in those ancient mountains. What's waiting in the darkness between the ponderosa pines, hungering for something that goes deeper than flesh and bone. David Jones had been my best friend since college, where we'd bonded over our shared love of the outdoors and our mutual inability to sit still in lecture halls. For over a decade, we'd hiked together across the American West, the Cascades, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, but the Gila was going to be our most ambitious trip yet. 5 days deep in the wilderness, far from any marked trails or ranger stations, in a place so remote that cell towers were just a distant memory. David had been obsessing over the area for months, ever since he discovered a cache of old mining records in the basement of the Silver City Library. He'd spent countless evenings in my apartment, poring over yellowed topographical maps and Xeroxed documents that looked like they'd been forgotten by time itself. The papers told of an abandoned copper mine near Mogollon Baldy Peak, hidden in a canyon that didn't appear on any modern maps. "Think about it, Mike," he'd said one particularly late night, spreading the brittle documents across my kitchen table with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient artifacts. A place so remote that even the Forest Service forgot about it. When's the last time we found somewhere truly untouched by the modern world? Somewhere that still holds its secrets? I should have paid more attention to the way his hands trembled when he handled those old papers. I should have noticed how his sleep patterns had changed, how he'd wake up in the middle of the night with a wild look in his eyes, mumbling about the deep places and what waits beneath. I should have wondered why the mine had been abandoned so completely that it vanished from official records, why there were no tourist markers or historical plaques acknowledging its existence. Most of all, I should have questioned why David's eyes had that fevered gleam when he talked about it. Not the excitement of a hiker planning an adventure, but the desperate hunger of an addict who'd found a new fix. But David had always been the leader in our friendship, the one who pushed us toward bigger challenges and more remote destinations. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I'd followed him up mountains and through canyons for over a decade without question. That was our dynamic, and it had served us well. I trusted him completely. That trust would almost cost me my life. We drove out on a Thursday morning in early October, when the aspens were bleeding gold against the dark shoulders of the mountains, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. David had been unusually quiet during the 3-hour drive from Albuquerque, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When I tried to make a conversation about our route or the weather forecast, he answered in monosyllables, as if speaking required enormous effort. The last outpost of civilization was Glenwood, a tiny settlement that seemed to exist solely to remind travelers how far they were from anywhere that mattered. The town consisted of a gas station, a general store, and a handful of weathered houses that looked like they'd been carved from the surrounding mountains themselves. The old-timer behind the gas station counter was a weathered man with skin like old leather and eyes like chipped flint, the kind of person who'd lived his entire life on the edge of the wilderness and learned to read its moods like other people read newspapers. "Y'all heading into the Gila?" he asked as David paid for our gas and last-minute supplies. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many optimistic hikers disappear into those mountains and never return. "That's the plan," David said, and I noticed his voice had taken on an artificial brightness, like an actor reciting lines. "Going to find some places that haven't seen footprints in decades." The old man's expression darkened, and he glanced through the window at the mountains looming beyond the town like sleeping giants. Their peaks were already dusted with early snow, white caps that looked like skulls against the dark sky. "Some places are best left unfound, son, especially this time of year, when the darkness comes early and stays late." "What do you mean?" I asked, but David was already moving toward the door, eager to be gone. The old man leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Apaches had stories about the deep country. Said some hungers never die, just wait. They wouldn't hunt in certain canyons, wouldn't even speak their names aloud. Said there were things in the earth that were old when the world was young, things that fed on more than meat and blood." David laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for the warning, old-timer. We'll be careful." but I noticed his hand trembling as he signed the credit card receipt, and the tremor wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation, like a junkie who'd finally scored after a long, dry spell. The drive up the forest road took another 3 hours, the last hour on increasingly rough dirt tracks that tested the limits of David's Jeep and my faith in internal combustion engines. We passed abandoned logging camps and rusted mining equipment, relics of a time when humans had thought they could tame this wilderness. Nature was slowly reclaiming it all, wrapping vines around machinery and sending roots through concrete foundations, patient and inexorable as time itself. David navigated the maze of unmarked roads with uncanny precision, never consulting his GPS or the paper maps spread across the dashboard. When I asked how he knew where to turn, he tapped his temple and smiled that artificial smile again. "I've been studying this area for months, Mike. Every trail, every landmark, every shortcut. I know it like my own backyard." But there was something wrong with his confidence, something that made my skin crawl. He drove like someone following instructions only he could hear, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a voice just beyond the range of my perception. We finally stopped at what David claimed was the closest vehicle access point to the hidden canyon, though I couldn't see any landmarks that matched the maps he'd shown me. The afternoon sun was already slipping behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood and casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us with grasping fingers. "We'll make camp here tonight," I suggested, eyeing the lengthening shadows with growing unease. "Start fresh in the morning when we have better light." But David was already shouldering his pack, his movements sharp and urgent, like someone racing against a deadline only he understood. "No, we need to get to the canyon before dark. I've been planning this for months, Mike. We're so close I can almost taste it." The way he said "taste it" made my stomach turn. There was hunger in his voice, raw and desperate, that went far beyond simple enthusiasm for a hiking destination. But David had always been the planner, the one who researched our routes and timed our departures. I'd learned to trust his judgment, even when it made me uncomfortable. I strapped on my pack and followed him into the tree line, leaving the Jeep behind like a lifeline to the rational world. The forest felt wrong from the moment we entered it. The trees grew too close together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so thick that the afternoon light barely penetrated to the forest floor. The normal sounds of the wilderness, bird calls, the rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind through leaves, were muted to almost nothing, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence, echoing off the trees like gunshots in a cathedral. "David, are you sure about the direction?" I asked after we'd been hiking for an hour. My GPS had lost signal completely the moment we'd entered the forest, and when I checked my compass, the needle spun lazily without settling on any particular bearing, as if magnetic north had simply ceased to exist. "Trust me," he said without turning around, his voice carrying an odd echo despite the thick trees around us. "I know exactly where we're going. I can feel it calling." The last part was spoken so quietly I almost didn't catch it, but the words sent ice through my veins. When I asked him to repeat himself, he claimed he hadn't said anything at all, but I noticed he wasn't consulting his map anymore. He walked with the purposeful stride of someone following a path only he could see, his head tilted at that strange angle, as if the trees themselves were whispering directions in his ear. The temperature dropped faster than physics should have allowed as we climbed deeper into the mountains. By the time we stopped to rest, David's first concession to normal human limitations, my breath was misting in air that felt 20 degrees colder than it had been an hour earlier. The cold was wrong, too. Not the clean bite of mountain air, but something damp and cloying that seemed to seep through my clothes and settle in my bones. When I pulled out my phone to check the time and our position, the screen flickered once and died, despite showing a full charge that morning. The device felt cold in my hands, colder than the air around us, as if something had drained more than just the battery. "Electronics acting up?" David asked, but there was no surprise in his voice. If anything, he seemed pleased, like this was exactly what he'd expected to happen. Dead battery, I guess. I tried the power button again with no result, then held down various combinations of buttons in a futile attempt to resurrect the device. "What time do you have?" David checked his watch, an expensive hiking timepiece he'd gotten for his birthday, and frowned. "That's weird. It stopped at 3:17. He tapped the crystal face, but the hands remained frozen in place like they'd been welded there. Must be the altitude affecting the mechanism. We'd hiked at much higher altitudes before without any issues, but I didn't argue. Something about the place was making me increasingly uneasy, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me want to constantly look over my shoulder. The trees seemed to lean inward as we passed, as if they were trying to close off our escape route, and I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly at it. "There," David said suddenly, pointing ahead to where the forest opened into a narrow canyon mouth. "That's it. That's where we need to go." The canyon entrance was a slash of absolute darkness between towering rock walls, so narrow that we'd have to walk single file. The gap looked like a wound in the earth, raw and infected, and the wind that emerged from its depths carried a smell that made my stomach clench with primitive revulsion. It was the stench of something that had been dead for a very long time, but underneath the decay was something else, something that smelled almost metallic, like old blood mixed with copper pennies. But there was a third component to the smell, something that my brain refused to process consciously, but that triggered every prey instinct evolution had hardwired into my DNA. It was the smell of hunger itself, patient and ancient and inexorably patient. "Jesus, David, what is that smell?" "Probably just a dead deer or something," he said, but his voice was tight with excitement rather than disgust. "Predators drag their kills into places like this to feed undisturbed." The explanation was reasonable, logical, exactly what anyone would assume, but the smell wasn't coming from any recently dead animal. It was older than that, deeper, like something had been rotting in that canyon for decades, or centuries. I wanted to turn back. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away from that canyon, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was waiting in those shadows. But David was already moving forward with eager, hungry steps, and the thought of being left alone in this place was even more terrifying than following him into the dark. The canyon walls rose on either side of us like the ribs of some massive beast, blocking out what little daylight remained and plunging us into a twilight gloom that seemed to have weight and substance. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, seeming to multiply and return to us from impossible directions, as if the canyon was full of invisible hikers all walking the same path at slightly different times. The smell grew stronger with each step until I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from retching. But even then, I could taste it on my tongue. Corruption and hunger and something that might have been sulfur, like the breath of something that had crawled up from the center of the earth. "David, seriously, we should set up camp outside the canyon. This place feels wrong." He stopped and turned to face me, and in the dim light his face was a pale oval floating in the darkness, his features blurred and indistinct. Or does it feel like exactly where we're supposed to be? There was something in his voice I'd never heard before, a note of cruel amusement that made my blood run cold. For a moment, standing there in the growing darkness of that ancient canyon, David looked like a stranger wearing my friend's face. Before I could respond, he disappeared around a bend in the canyon wall. I hurried to catch up, my heart pounding with a fear that seemed disproportionate to the situation, but utterly appropriate to some deeper level of understanding my conscious mind couldn't access. When I rounded the corner, I found myself in a circular clearing surrounded by sheer rock walls that rose into the darkness above like the walls of a natural cathedral. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone, spirals and figures that hurt to look at directly, as if they'd been designed by eyes that processed light differently than human ones. The symbols seemed to move when I wasn't looking at them directly, shifting and rearranging themselves into new patterns that told stories I didn't want to understand. At the far end of the clearing was the mine entrance David had been searching for, a black hole in the rock face that seemed to swallow light. Railroad ties rotted in front of it like broken teeth, and rusted mining equipment lay scattered around the clearing like the bones of mechanical dinosaurs. But what made my blood freeze was the smell that poured from that entrance. Not just decay, but something active and hungry, like the breath of something vast and malevolent that had been sleeping in the earth for longer than human civilization had existed. "This is it," David whispered, his voice filled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. "This is where it all started." "Where what started?" I managed to ask, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "The hunger." He dropped his pack and began setting up his tent with mechanical precision, his movements too quick and precise to be entirely natural. The first reports came from this mine in 1887, miners going missing one by one. The ones who came back changed. The Apache wouldn't come within 10 miles of this place even before the mine was dug. They had words for what lived here, words they wouldn't speak aloud even in their own language. "David, what the hell are you talking about? You said this was just an abandoned copper mine. You said we were here to explore and take photographs." He looked up at me, and for a moment his face was completely expressionless, like a mask that had slipped to reveal nothing but darkness underneath. Then he smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide, too eager, like someone who had forgotten how smiling was supposed to work and was approximating it from corrupted memory. "It was never about copper, Mike. They were mining something else entirely, something that had been sleeping in the rock for centuries, maybe millennia, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to wake it up. And when they did..." He gestured toward the mine entrance with something that might have been pride. "Well, some hungers can't be satisfied with conventional food." I backed away from him, my hands fumbling for my pack straps. The David I'd known for over a decade was gone, replaced by something that wore his face and spoke with his voice but thought with a mind that belonged to something else entirely. "David, you're scaring me. What's gotten into you?" "Nothing's gotten into me," he said, returning to his tent setup with disturbing calm. "Not yet, anyway. But it will. That's why we're here. That's why I brought you here." The way he said "brought you here" made my blood run cold, like I was cargo instead of a friend, like this whole trip had been orchestrated for reasons I couldn't understand, a trap baited with friendship and adventure and sprung in this godforsaken canyon where no one would hear me scream. I set up my own tent as far from the mine entrance as the circular clearing would allow, though there was nowhere in that place that felt safe. As darkness fell with unnatural speed, the petroglyphs seemed to move more actively in my peripheral vision, the spirals turning slowly like lazy whirlpools that led to somewhere human eyes weren't meant to see. The temperature continued to drop until my breath formed thick clouds in the air and frost began to form on the outside of my tent, despite the fact that it was only early October and we weren't at a particularly high altitude. David built a fire using wood he'd somehow gathered without leaving the clearing, but the flames burned wrong. Too blue, too cold, casting shadows that moved independently of the firelight. The shadows danced across the canyon walls like living things, forming shapes that almost looked like human figures before dissolving back into formless darkness. He sat staring into the mine entrance for hours, not blinking, barely breathing, his eyes reflecting the weird blue light like those of a nocturnal predator. When I tried to start a conversation about our plans for the next day or the strange atmospheric conditions, he answered in monosyllables without looking away from that black hole in the rock. "I'm going to get some sleep," I announced finally, unable to stand the oppressive silence and David's inhuman stillness any longer. "You do that," David said, and his voice carried a note of anticipation that made my skin crawl. "I'll keep watch." "Watch for what?" He turned to look at me then, and in the blue firelight his smile was all teeth. "For when it decides to come out and play." I retreated to my tent, but sleep was impossible. The darkness beyond the thin nylon walls seemed alive, pressing against the fabric like something trying to get in. Strange sounds echoed from the depths of the canyon. Not animal sounds, but something like voices speaking in a language that predated human speech. Words that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate in my bones. The temperature inside my sleeping bag dropped so low that my teeth were chattering despite the high-quality insulation, and I could see my breath in the cramped confines of the tent. But worse than the cold was the sense that something was watching me, studying me with inhuman patience, learning my patterns and weaknesses while I lay helpless in my nylon cocoon. Sometime after midnight, though time seemed to have become fluid in that place, I heard David moving around outside. His footsteps circled my tent slowly, deliberately, pausing at regular intervals as if he was examining it from every angle. I held my breath waiting for him to call my name or unzip the door, but he just stood there. I could sense him breathing on the other side of the fabric, could almost feel his eyes boring through the nylon to find me huddled in my sleeping bag like a terrified child. The footsteps completed 3 full circuits of my tent before moving away. I heard the sound of the fire being stirred, then silence so complete it seemed to have weight. When I finally worked up the courage to peer through a gap in the tent flap, David was gone. The fire still burned with those unnatural blue flames, but his sleeping bag was empty, unzipped from the inside as if he'd simply slithered out of it like a snake shedding its skin. I should have packed up immediately and hiked out of the canyon, even in the dark. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible before whatever had taken David decided it was hungry for something more. But the thought of navigating those narrow canyon passages alone, with whatever had taken my friend possibly watching from the shadows, paralyzed me with terror more complete than anything I'd ever experienced. I spent the rest of the night clutching my knife, a pathetic weapon against whatever lived in that mine, listening for any sound that might tell me where David had gone or what had happened to him. But the canyon remained silent except for those distant voices speaking in their inhuman language, getting closer as the night wore on. Dawn came like a reluctant witness, gray light filtering down between the canyon walls without bringing any warmth or comfort. The fire had burned down to cold ashes that held no trace of heat, and there was no sign that David had ever returned. His tent was still set up exactly as he'd left it, his pack still lay where he'd dropped it, but the man himself had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him. I called his name until my voice echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a wounded animal. The petroglyphs seemed to stare down at me accusingly, as if I was the intruder here, as if David had simply returned to where he belonged. But my shouts produced no response except for a strange echo that sounded almost like laughter. It took me 3 hours to work up the courage to approach the mine entrance. The smell that poured from it was so intense now that it made my eyes water and my throat close up, but underneath the decay was something else. Something that smelled almost like cooked meat, charred and greasy and wrong in ways that made my stomach turn. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness beyond the entrance, but I could see that the tunnel went much deeper than any copper mine should have needed to go, disappearing into the earth at an angle that seemed to lead toward the center of the world. "David!" I shouted into the depths. My voice echoed back distorted. The sound stretched and twisted until it barely sounded human anymore. I took exactly 3 steps into the tunnel before every primitive instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. The walls were covered with scratch marks that looked too deliberate to be random, forming patterns that hurt to follow with my eyes, spirals and symbols that matched the petroglyphs outside but seemed older, more primitive, as if they'd been carved by something that had been trying to remember how to be human and failing. The floor was littered with bones. Not just animal bones, but shapes that were unnaturally long and twisted, as if whatever they'd belonged to had been stretched on some medieval torture device. Some of the bones were old, yellowed with age, but others looked recent, fresh, still had scraps of flesh clinging to them. That's when I heard the sound that still wakes me up screaming 3 times a week. It came from deep in the tunnel, a wet sliding noise like something massive dragging itself across stone, accompanied by a clicking sound that might have been claws on rock or teeth chattering with hunger. And underneath it all, barely audible, was David's voice calling my name. But it wasn't David. Not anymore. The voice was right. The same timbre, the same inflection, the same slight accent he'd picked up during his childhood in Texas, but there was something underneath it that had never been human. Something that was using David's voice like an ill-fitting mask, stretching and distorting it until it almost sounded right, but not quite. "Mike," the voice called again, closer now, echoing from the darkness with unnatural clarity. "Mike, come help me. I'm hurt. I'm trapped down here and I can't move. Please, Mike, I need you." The words were perfect, exactly what David would have said in that situation, but they were wrong in ways that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the reptilian part of my brain that knew when something was hunting it. There was hunger in that voice, desperate and patient and utterly inhuman, the kind of hunger that could wait decades for the right prey to stumble into its web. I ran. I left everything behind, my tent, my pack, my supplies, everything except the clothes on my back and the knife clutched in my trembling hand, and ran for the canyon entrance like the devil himself was on my heels. Behind me, that thing that sounded like David called my name over and over, each repetition more perfect than the last, as if it was learning how to be him with each iteration. "Mike, where are you going? Mike, come back. Mike, don't leave me here alone." The canyon walls seemed to close in as I ran, the passages becoming narrower and more twisted than they had been the day before, as if the place was actively trying to trap me. Several times I was certain I'd taken a wrong turn, that I'd never find my way out, that I'd end up wandering those stone corridors until I collapsed from exhaustion and became just another meal for whatever lived in the darkness below. But panic gave me strength and speed I didn't know I possessed, and I finally burst from the canyon mouth into the forest like a cork from a champagne bottle. I didn't stop running until I reached the jeep, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion and terror. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and when the engine turned over, the sound was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. Mechanical and rational and completely, utterly human. I drove back toward civilization without looking in the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see following me down the mountain roads. I made it to Glenwood in half the time it had taken us to drive up, and I didn't stop until I was standing in the gas station where the old-timer had warned us away from the deep country. He took one look at my face and poured me a cup of coffee without being asked. "Where's your friend?" he asked quietly. "Gone," I said, and the word tasted like ash in my mouth. "Something took him." The old man nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "The hunger?" I stared at him, wondering how he could possibly know what I'd encountered in that canyon. "What do you know about it?" "My grandfather was Apache," he said, settling heavily onto a stool behind the counter. "He told me stories about the deep places, about things that were old when the first humans walked these mountains. Said there were certain canyons where the earth itself was sick, where something had been sleeping so long that it had become part of the rock and stone. What is it? Nobody knows for sure. The Apache called it the hunger that wears faces, but they had other names too. The Spanish miners called it el hambre, the hunger, said it could take the shape of anyone who died in those tunnels, use their voices to call down more prey." He studied my face with those ancient eyes. "Did it sound like your friend?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Then he's gone," the old man said with finality. "Whatever you heard calling your name, it wasn't him anymore. It was just the hunger wearing his skin." I called the rangers from the gas station, and they mounted a search and rescue operation that lasted 4 days. They found David's body in the mine, or what was left of it. The official report said he'd fallen into an abandoned shaft and died from his injuries, but I saw the photographs when I identified his remains. What they found barely looked human anymore. The bones were wrong, stretched and twisted like they'd been reshaped by something that didn't understand how human anatomy was supposed to work. His arms were too long, his fingers extended into points, and his spine had been bent at angles that should have been impossible. But the worst part wasn't what had been done to his body. The worst part was his face, frozen in an expression of such pure animalistic hunger that the medical examiner refused to look at the remains directly. His mouth was opened impossibly wide, as if he'd died trying to swallow something enormous, and his teeth had been filed to points. But his eyes were still David's, still held that fevered gleam I'd seen when he talked about the canyon, but magnified 1,000-fold into something that barely belonged in a human skull. The Rangers asked me dozens of questions about what had happened, but how could I tell them the truth? How could I explain that something in that mine had taken my best friend and worn his skin like a costume? That whatever David had become was still down there in the dark, waiting for the next group of hikers to stumble into its web? I told them David had decided to explore the mine alone despite my warnings, that I'd searched for him but found no trace. It was close enough to the truth to satisfy their investigation, and they ruled his death an accident caused by falling into an unmarked mine shaft. Case closed, but it's not closed for me. It will never be closed. Because 3 months after David's funeral, I got a phone call. The caller ID showed David's cell phone number, the same phone that had been found crushed beyond repair in the mine collapse that killed him. When I answered with shaking hands, I heard his voice, clearer than it had ever been in life. "Mike," it said, and I could hear the smile in those words. Could he picture his face even though I knew it was no longer his face making that expression? "I'm so glad you made it out. I was worried I'd lost you too." "You're dead," I whispered into the phone, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I saw your body. I identified your remains." "Oh, that old thing?" The voice carried a note of amusement that was purely David, but also something else, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. "I don't need it anymore. I've got something much better now. Something that lets me reach so much further than I ever could before." The voice dropped to a whisper, and I could hear other sounds in the background. The scrape of claws on stone, the wet slide of something massive moving through darkness, and underneath it all, the distant sound of other voices calling names in the darkness, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. "I'm coming to see you soon, Mike. I've got so much to show you, so much to share. The hunger is growing, and it needs more than what it can catch in that little canyon. It needs to spread, to find new places to feed, and you're going to help me." The line went dead, but the silence that followed was somehow worse than the voice. I threw the phone across the room and watched it shatter against the wall, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever David had become, whatever was wearing his voice like a stolen coat, it had marked me. It knew where I was. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've moved 3 times, changed my name twice, and gotten a new phone number that only 2 people know. But the calls keep coming. Sometimes it's David's voice. Sometimes it's the voices of other hikers who've gone missing in the Gila over the years. Voices I recognize from missing person reports and newspaper articles about hiking accidents in the wilderness. They all say the same thing, that they're coming to find me, that they want to share what they've learned in the dark places beneath the earth, that the hunger is growing and spreading, and soon it won't need to wait for prey to come to it. Soon it will be able to walk in the sunlight, wearing the faces of the missing, and no canyon or mine shaft will be able to contain it. The doctors say it's trauma-induced hallucinations, that survivors' guilt is manifesting as auditory delusions. They've put me on enough medication to tranquilize a horse, but the pills don't stop the calls. They don't stop the dreams where I'm back in that canyon, walking toward the mine entrance with David's hungry smile carved into my face. Last week, I found scratches on my bedroom window, the same spiral patterns that had been carved into the canyon walls. When I called the police, they said it was probably just birds or tree branches. But I know better. It's getting closer. Whatever took David, whatever has been calling me with the voices of the dead, it's tired of waiting. I'm writing this down because I know my time is running out. Tomorrow, I'm going back to the Gila, back to that canyon where it all started. Not because I want to, but because I have to. Because the hunger that lives in that mine has been growing stronger, and now it's hungry for me. The rangers will find my body eventually, probably in the same condition they found David's. They'll rule it another hiking accident, another unfortunate soul who ventured too deep into the wilderness and paid the price. But maybe someone will read this account first. Maybe someone will understand what really happened out there. If you're reading this, stay away from the Gila wilderness. Stay away from any canyon where the petroglyphs hurt to look at and the darkness feels alive. Some places are best left unexplored. Some hungers are better left unfed. And if you ever get a phone call from someone you know is dead, don't answer it. Don't let their voice into your head, because once it's there, it never leaves. It just waits, growing stronger, learning your weaknesses until you're ready to join them in the dark. I can hear my phone ringing now. David's name is flashing on the caller ID, even though I changed my number again yesterday and threw the old phone into the Rio Grande. This time, I think I'm going to answer. This time, I think I'm ready to hear what he has to say. After all, what's the worst that could happen? I'm already dead. I just haven't stopped breathing yet. The hunger is calling, and I'm so very, very tired of running. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Gila wilderness of southwestern New Mexico, near the old mining ghost town of Mogollon, during what was supposed to be a romantic camping getaway that ended up becoming the most terrifying experience of my life. Michael and I had been together for 3 years, and tensions had been building between us for months. His job as an insurance adjuster was eating him alive, and my work as a graphic designer felt increasingly meaningless. We barely talked anymore, just existed in the same apartment like polite strangers. The camping trip was my desperate attempt to reconnect, to find whatever spark had drawn us together in the first place. "We need this," I told him while showing him photos of the rugged Mogollon Mountains online. "No cell service, no distractions, just us." Michael had agreed with the tired enthusiasm of someone going through the motions. But as we loaded our gear into his Jeep that Friday morning in late October, I caught glimpses of genuine excitement in his eyes. Maybe this would work after all. The drive from Albuquerque took us through increasingly desolate terrain. Scrub brush and twisted juniper trees stretched endlessly under a pale sky that seemed too big, too empty. The radio had given up trying to find stations hours ago, leaving us with static and the hum of tires on asphalt. "You sure about this place?" Michael asked as we turned onto Forest Road 159, a dirt track that immediately began testing his Jeep's suspension. "Looks like the middle of nowhere." "That's the point," I said, though the isolation was already making me feel uneasy. The mountains loomed ahead of us, dark and jagged against the afternoon sky. Ancient ponderosa pines clung to the slopes like desperate fingers. We'd planned to camp near West Fork Creek, about 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. Far enough from civilization to feel like an adventure, close enough to hike out if something went wrong. At least, that had been the theory. The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks when we found what looked like a decent spot, a small clearing beside the creek, sheltered by massive boulders and surrounded by dense forest. Michael parked the Jeep, and we began unloading our gear in the golden, late-afternoon light. "This is beautiful," I said, and meant it. The creek babbled peacefully over smooth stones, and the air smelled of pine and something wild and clean. For the first time in months, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Michael was examining the fire ring someone had built from local stones. "Looks like we're not the first ones to camp here." As we set up our tent, the forest around us began to settle into evening. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and shadows stretched long and dark between the trees. I pulled on a fleece jacket and helped Michael gather kindling for a fire. That's when I first noticed something was off. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no insects humming. Even the creek seemed to muffle its voice. The quiet pressed against my eardrums like a physical thing. "Do you hear that?" I asked Michael. He paused in his wood gathering, head tilted. Hear what? That's just it. Nothing. No sounds at all. Michael shrugged. Maybe we scared the wildlife. We were making a lot of noise setting up. But the silence felt wrong, predatory, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. We got the fire going as full darkness fell, and the flames pushed back the shadows that seemed eager to creep closer to our little circle of light. Michael opened 2 beers from our cooler, and we sat on a fallen log, trying to recapture some romantic mood. Remember our first camping trip? I asked. Up in the Sangre de Cristos? You made me check the tent for spiders 3 times, Michael said, and I heard a hint of his old warmth. I hate spiders. I know. That's why I... He stopped mid-sentence, head turning toward the trees. What is it? Thought I heard something, like... He frowned, listening intently. Like someone whistling. I strained my ears, but heard only the fire crackling and the subdued murmur of the creek. I don't hear anything. Must have been the wind. But there was no wind. The air hung perfectly still, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and something else underneath. Something organic and slightly rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. We tried to keep talking, to maintain the illusion of a normal evening, but conversation felt forced. Michael kept glancing over his shoulder at the darkness beyond our fire's reach, and I found myself doing the same. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe just at the edge of vision, and more than once I could have sworn I saw something tall and pale moving between the trees. Maybe we should turn in early, Michael suggested around 10 o'clock. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and neither of us had been eager to add more wood. Each trip to the woodpile at the edge of our camp felt like venturing into hostile territory. I was exhausted, but strangely wired, adrenaline humming through my veins for no reason I could identify. Good idea. We banked the fire and crawled into our tent. The thin nylon walls suddenly felt pathetically inadequate, like tissue paper between us and whatever waited in the darkness outside. Michael zipped the tent flap shut, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Jen? His voice was barely a whisper. I love you. The words hung between us, loaded with 3 years of history and recent months of growing apart. I love you too. But even as I said it, even as we settled into our sleeping bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening to every word. Sleep came in fragments, broken by strange dreams and the persistent sensation that something was moving around our tent. Twice I jerked awake, convinced I'd heard footsteps circling us, but Michael slept deeply beside me, undisturbed. The third time I woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the tent walls. Michael's sleeping bag was empty. Michael? I called softly, then louder. Michael! No answer. I unzipped the tent flap and stuck my head out. Our campsite looked exactly as we'd left it the night before. Fire ring cold and dead, our gear neatly arranged, but Michael was nowhere to be seen. I pulled on my hiking boots and jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and still, carrying the clean scent of pine and creek water. Normal forest sounds had returned, birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. Whatever unnatural quiet had gripped the night was gone. "Michael!" I shouted, cupping my hands around my mouth. My voice echoed off the surrounding canyon walls and faded into silence. I walked the perimeter of our camp, looking for signs of where he might have gone. Near the creek, I found his footprints in the soft earth, leading downstream toward a narrow canyon that cut deeper into the wilderness. The prints looked normal at first glance, but something about them bothered me. It took me several minutes to realize what. They were perfectly spaced, as if Michael had been walking with mechanical precision rather than his usual casual stride. I followed the trail for about a quarter mile, calling his name every few minutes. The canyon walls grew higher and more confining, cutting off most of the morning light. The creek narrowed to a trickle, and the footprints became harder to follow on the rocky ground. That's when I found his shirt. It was hanging from a low branch about 8 feet off the ground, as if someone had thrown it there. The fabric was shredded, dark stains that might have been blood marking the tears. My hands shook as I pulled it down and examined it. Definitely blood, still tacky to the touch. "Michael!" I screamed, no longer caring about maintaining composure. The sound bounced off the canyon walls and came back distorted, like multiple voices calling his name. I should have gone back to camp, should have hiked out to get help. But panic was setting in, making rational thought difficult. Instead, I pushed deeper into the canyon, following what I thought might be more footprints, driven by the desperate hope that Michael was injured somewhere ahead and needed my help. The canyon twisted and branched, becoming a maze of narrow passages and dead ends. I lost track of time, of direction, of everything except the need to find Michael. The walls closed in until I could touch both sides by spreading my arms, and the strip of sky overhead became a thin blue line. When I finally admitted I was lost and turned to retrace my steps, I couldn't find the way back. Every passage looked the same: gray stone walls streaked with mineral deposits, scattered boulders, patches of scrubby vegetation. I tried to follow the creek, but it seemed to flow in impossible directions, sometimes uphill, sometimes disappearing entirely into cracks in the rock. The sun was directly overhead when I found the cave. It was hidden behind a fall of boulders, a dark opening barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The smell hit me first, that same organic rot I'd noticed the night before, but stronger now, mixed with something musky and animal. Fresh claw marks scored the stone around the entrance, deep gouges that looked recent. I should have turned around, should have run, but I could hear something from inside the cave, a low moaning that might have been Michael's voice. "Michael, are you in there? Are you hurt?" The moaning stopped. Silence stretched for long seconds, then, "Jennifer?" Michael's voice, but wrong somehow, flat and emotionless. "Is that you?" Relief flooded through me despite the wrongness. "Yes, are you okay? I've been looking everywhere." "I'm hurt. Can you help me?" I squeezed through the cave entrance using my phone's flashlight to navigate. The narrow passage opened into a larger chamber, and my light revealed things that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. Bones. Lots of bones, scattered across the cave floor like discarded toys. Animal bones mostly. Deer, elk, smaller creatures, but some that looked disturbingly human. They'd been cracked open, the marrow sucked out, and many showed signs of teeth marks too large to belong to any normal predator. "Jennifer," Michael's voice came from deeper in the cave, in a side passage I couldn't see into. "Please help me." I should have run then. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but the sound of Michael's voice, even wrong as it was, drew me forward. Love makes people do stupid things. The side passage was barely tall enough to walk upright. My phone's light danced across more bones, and strange symbols scratched into the walls. They looked old, primitive, like cave paintings, but more sinister. Twisted figures that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. "Almost there," Michael's voice said, though I still couldn't see him. Just a little further. The passage opened into another chamber, this one larger than the first. My light swept across the space and froze on the far wall, where Michael was sitting with his back against the stone. Except it wasn't Michael. Not exactly. The thing wearing Michael's face smiled at me with teeth that were too sharp, too many. Its eyes reflected my phone's light like an animal's, and when it moved, its joints bent in ways that human joints shouldn't. It was naked, and its skin had a gray pallor that made it look like a corpse. "Hello, Jennifer," it said in Michael's voice. "I've been waiting for you." I turned to run, but the passage behind me was blocked. Another figure stood silhouetted against the dim light from the outer chamber. Tall, gaunt, with elongated limbs and fingers that ended in claws. This one wasn't trying to look human. Its face was a skull-like mask of stretched skin, and when it smiled, I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth. "The Navajo have a word for us," the Michael thing said conversationally. "Skinwalker. We wear the shapes of those we hunt. Your boyfriend was quite cooperative once we explained the situation." "Where is he?" I whispered. "What did you do to Michael?" "Oh, he's still here." The thing patted its stomach. "Most of him, anyway. We saved the best parts for you." The creature blocking the passage began to advance, and I pressed my back against the wall, trapped between them. My phone's light flickered and dimmed, battery dying at the worst possible moment. "Don't be afraid," the Michael thing said, standing with fluid grace. "It won't hurt for long. We're quite efficient." I don't remember making the conscious decision to fight. Terror must have triggered some deep survival instinct because suddenly I was moving, diving toward the creature in the passage with a scream that didn't sound like my own voice. My phone flew from my hand, and we plunged into absolute darkness. Claws raked across my back, tearing through my jacket and drawing blood, but adrenaline made me fast and desperate. I felt my fingers connect with something soft. An eye, maybe, and the creature shrieked and stumbled backward. I pushed past it into the outer chamber, navigating by memory and luck in the complete darkness. Behind me, both creatures were moving, their claws clicking on stone as they gave chase. The cave entrance was somewhere ahead, that blessed crack of daylight I needed to reach. My groping hands found the wall, and I felt my way along it, moving as fast as I dared. The creature's breathing was close behind me, along with other sounds, wet, sliding noises that I didn't want to think about. Light. A thin sliver of daylight marking the cave entrance. I squeezed through the opening, tearing my jacket on the rough stone, and emerged into the canyon gasping and bleeding. The creatures didn't follow immediately. Maybe they couldn't tolerate direct sunlight, or maybe they were just toying with me. Either way, I had a head start. I ran through the maze of canyons, no longer trying to navigate, just putting distance between myself and the cave. My back burned where the claws had raked me, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare stop. Somehow, luck, divine intervention, or simple desperation, I found my way back to our campsite. The Jeep sat exactly where Michael had parked it, keys still in the ignition. I threw our gear into the back without bothering to break down the tent properly and gunned the engine. The dirt road seemed to go on forever, every shadow between the trees a potential hiding place for creatures that wore stolen faces. But eventually, I reached pavement, then the highway, then civilization. I drove straight to the state police station in Silver City and told them everything. They listened with the professional skepticism of people who'd heard too many stories from traumatized hikers, but they organized a search team anyway. Michael was officially listed as missing, and I was treated for scratches and mild exposure. The search teams found our abandoned campsite and the cave I'd described, but no trace of Michael. No trace of the creatures either. The bones I'd seen were gone and the symbols on the walls had been scratched away, leaving only fresh gouges in the stone. "Animals," the lead searcher told me. "Probably a bear den. Sometimes they'll drag prey back to their caves, and the scratches on your back are consistent with bear claws. As for your boyfriend, people get lost in the wilderness all the time. The Gila is unforgiving country." But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The way the thing had used Michael's voice, had known my name, had spoken with intelligence no bear possessed. They never found Michael's body. After 3 weeks, the search was called off, and I was left with nothing but nightmares and the insurance paperwork from his death certificate. I've never been camping since. Can't stand the darkness, can't tolerate silence, can't shake the feeling that something is always watching from just outside the light. I live in the city now, surrounded by people and noise and electric lights that burn all night long. But sometimes, usually around 3 in the morning when the streets are quiet and shadows pool deep between buildings, I hear Michael's voice calling my name. It's always flat and emotionless, just like in the cave, and it always comes from places where no human voice should be. Storm drains, abandoned buildings, dark alleys that smell of rot and animal musk. I've learned not to answer. I've learned that some things wearing familiar faces should never be trusted, no matter how much you want to believe they're real. Michael is gone. Whatever wears his voice in the darkness is something else entirely, something that hunts at the edges of human civilization, wearing the shapes of those it has consumed. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is still, I can hear it getting closer. The scratches on my back healed months ago, but I still feel them burning when darkness falls. 3 parallel lines that serve as a permanent reminder of what lurks in the spaces between our safe, lit world and the vast wilderness that surrounds it. I should have known better, should have researched the area more thoroughly, should have paid attention to the local stories and warnings. The Navajo didn't settle in the Gila region without good reason. They knew what lived in those canyons, what hunted in the darkness between the trees. They knew about the skinwalkers, but I was young and naive and desperate to save a failing relationship. I thought a romantic getaway could fix what was broken between us, could restore the connection we'd lost to stress and time and the grinding monotony of modern life. Instead, I led the man I loved directly into the jaws of something that wore his face as a mask and spoke with his stolen voice. I brought him to a place where ancient predators waited patiently for foolish humans to venture too far from the safety of their electric lights and cell phone towers. The guilt is almost worse than the fear. Almost. But in my darker moments, usually in the small hours when sleep won't come and every shadow seems to hide watching eyes, I wonder if Michael was already gone before we ever reached the Gila. If whatever took him had been following us for weeks or months, learning his mannerisms, his voice, his expressions, getting ready to make the switch when the opportunity presented itself. I wonder if the Michael who agreed to the camping trip, who loaded gear into the Jeep with tired enthusiasm, who told me he loved me in our tent that last night, I wonder if that was really Michael at all. The thought terrifies me more than anything else, because it means the thing that hunts in the darkness has been closer than I ever imagined. It means there might not be any safe distance, any protected space where human reason and electric lights can keep the old predators at bay. It means they've learned to live among us, wearing our faces, speaking with our voices, until we can no longer tell the difference between the hunters and the hunted. I check my locks 3 times every night before bed. I sleep with lights on in every room. I've installed security cameras and motion sensors and every technological barrier I can think of. But deep down, I know none of it will matter when they finally come for me, because I'm the one who got away. The witness who escaped their feeding ground and told the story they'd prefer remains secret. And, sooner or later, they'll come to collect what they see as rightfully theirs. When that time comes, I only hope I'm strong enough to run again, smart enough not to trust familiar voices calling from dark places, quick enough to reach the light before the darkness swallows me whole. But mostly, I hope it happens quickly, and that whatever wears my face afterward treats the people I love with more mercy than they showed Michael. The Gila wilderness remains open to hikers and campers, though several people have gone missing in the area since our trip. The authorities blame the usual suspects, getting lost, falling into crevasses, animal attacks, but I know better. I know what's really out there, waiting in the spaces between civilization and the wild. I know that some hungers are older than human memory, and some predators have learned to use our love and trust against us. And I know that no matter how bright we make our lights or how high we build our walls, the darkness always finds a way in. It's patient. It's clever, and it's always hungry. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Gila wilderness of New Mexico, and it's still happening every night when I close my eyes and hear Michael's voice calling from the shadows. Some stories don't have endings. Some horrors don't stay buried in the past. Some things follow you home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Gila wilderness of New Mexico, near the Mogollon Mountains in October of last year. I should have known something was wrong the moment we crossed into the wilderness. The silence hit us first. Not the peaceful quiet you'd expect in nature, but something oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Our group of 4 had been planning this camping trip for months. There was me, Sarah Chen from accounting, Marcus Rodriguez from IT, and Jenny Patterson from marketing. We'd all worked together at the same software company in Albuquerque for 3 years, but this was our first time venturing into the wilderness together. Sarah had been the one to suggest the Gila. She'd grown up in nearby Silver City and claimed to know the area well, though she'd seemed strangely reluctant to discuss the specifics when we pressed her for details. "Just trust me," she'd said, her usual bright smile not quite reaching her eyes. "It's beautiful up there, completely isolated." The drive up Highway 15 had been uneventful until we turned onto the Forest Service road leading to our chosen campsite near the middle fork of the Gila River. The GPS had started glitching about 5 miles in, the screen flickering between our location and blank static. Marcus, ever the tech guy, had laughed it off. "Mountain interference," he'd said, though I noticed his confidence wavering when his phone showed no signal bars at all. We'd parked at the trailhead just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Mogollon Range. The autumn air carried an unseasonable chill, and the aspen leaves rustled with a sound like whispered warnings. Jenny, always the optimist, had started unpacking with characteristic enthusiasm, her red hair catching the last rays of sunlight like flame. "God, it's gorgeous up here," she'd said, spreading her arms wide to encompass the vast expanse of wilderness stretching in every direction. The nearest town was Silver City, nearly 40 miles away. The nearest person could be anywhere, or nowhere. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made my skin crawl. We hiked about 2 miles into the wilderness before Sarah declared she'd found the perfect spot, a small clearing beside a tributary of the Middle Fork, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater that blocked out most of the sky. Marcus had immediately started setting up his expensive 4-season tent, while Jenny and I gathered firewood from the surrounding forest. It was while collecting kindling that I first noticed the trees. Not all of them, just certain ones scattered throughout the forest. Pines and firs with strange markings carved deep into their bark. The cuts were too precise to be natural, too old to be recent, and they formed patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to follow them. Some of the marks wept a dark, resinous substance that stained the bark black. "Hey, Sarah," I'd called out when we returned to camp, arms full of deadfall. "What are these markings on the trees?" Sarah had been crouched beside her backpack sorting through her gear with mechanical precision. When she looked up, her face was blank for just a moment too long before recognition flickered in her eyes. "Probably old Navajo trail markers," she'd said quickly, then returned to her sorting. "This area has a lot of Native American history." But something in her voice felt wrong. Sarah was usually a fountain of historical trivia. She'd majored in anthropology before falling into the corporate world, yet her explanation felt rehearsed, hollow. Marcus had gotten the fire going just as full darkness settled over the wilderness like a suffocating blanket. The flames cast dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. The darkness beyond our small circle of light wasn't just an absence of illumination. It felt solid, pressing, alive. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Jenny had whispered, unconsciously scooting closer to the fire. "It's just the unfamiliar environment," Marcus had replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our brains are wired to perceive threats in the dark. It's evolutionary psychology." Sarah hadn't said anything. She sat cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire, staring into the flames with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. In the flickering light, her features seemed sharper somehow, more angular. When she finally looked up and caught me watching her, she smiled, but it was a smile I'd never seen on Sarah's face before. Too wide, too knowing. "Tell us a ghost story, Sarah," Jenny had suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "You know this area. You must know some local legends." For a moment, Sarah's expression went completely blank. Then that strange smile returned. "There are things in these mountains," she said slowly, "that are older than the trees, older than the stones. Things that learned to wear human faces long before humans ever set foot here." The way she said it made my blood run cold. This wasn't Sarah's usual storytelling voice, warm and animated. This was something else entirely. The words came out flat, matter of fact, like she was reading from a textbook. "Sarah?" Marcus said uncertainly. "You okay?" She blinked, and suddenly she was normal Sarah again, laughing and shaking her head. "Sorry, got a little too into character there. I've been reading too much Navajo folklore lately. Did you know this area is supposed to be a hotspot for skinwalker activity?" The word hit the group like a physical blow. Even Marcus, the skeptic, visibly flinched. "Jesus, Sarah," Jenny breathed. "Maybe save the skinwalker talk for when we're not sleeping in the middle of nowhere." We tried to keep the mood light after that, but something had changed. The darkness seemed to press closer, and every sound from the forest, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made us freeze and listen. By 10 o'clock, we'd all retreated to our tents, though sleep felt impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness. Owls called from the darkness, their voices eerily human-like. Something large moved through the underbrush nearby, branches breaking under its weight. But it was the silence between the sounds that truly unnerved me. Moments when the entire forest seemed to stop breathing, as if every living thing was hiding from something prowling in the dark. I must have dozed eventually because I was jerked awake by Jenny's scream. "Where's Sarah?" she was shouting. "Where's Sarah?" I stumbled out of my tent to find Jenny standing beside Sarah's collapsed shelter, her flashlight beam revealing an empty sleeping bag. The bag was unzipped from the inside, but there were no footprints in the soft earth around the tent. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished. Marcus emerged from his tent, hair disheveled and eyes wide with panic. "What's going on?" "Sarah's gone," Jenny said, her voice cracking. "Her tent was open, but I don't see any tracks, any sign of where she went." We spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling Sarah's name into the darkness. Our flashlight beams seemed pathetically weak against the oppressive black of the forest. Every shadow could hide a body. Every silence could mean death. The marked trees loomed around us like sentinels, their strange carvings seeming to writhe in the shifting light. It was Marcus who suggested we wait until dawn to continue the search. "We could get lost out there," he said, though his voice shook with the effort of being rational. "We could fall, get hurt. Sarah's smart. She might have just gone to relieve herself and gotten turned around. She'll find her way back." But none of us believed it. The Sarah we knew wouldn't have wandered off alone in the dark. She was cautious to a fault, the kind of person who checked and double-checked every piece of equipment before a trip. Something had happened to her. We huddled around the rebuilt fire, taking turns keeping watch. Every time the flames dimmed, the darkness seemed to surge forward like a living thing. I found myself fixated on the tree line, convinced I could see shapes moving just beyond the reach of the light, tall, angular figures that vanished whenever I tried to focus on them. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if the sun itself was afraid to illuminate what the night might have left behind. As soon as there was enough light to see, we began our search in earnest, spreading out in a grid pattern but staying within shouting distance of each other. It was Jenny who found the blood. "Over here," she called, her voice sharp with horror. We converged on her position about 50 yards from our campsite. Dark stains marked the ground in a rough circle, the earth torn up as if there had been a struggle, but there were no footprints, no drag marks, nothing to indicate what had happened or where Sarah might have gone. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus muttered, kneeling beside the stains. "Where are the tracks? Where's the body?" "Maybe animals carried her off," Jenny suggested weakly. "Mountain lions, bears. No, I said, studying the scene. Look at the pattern. This isn't scavenger activity, and there's not enough blood for… I stopped myself before finishing the thought. Not enough blood for her to be dead here. We spent the morning expanding our search, following game trails and creek beds, shouting Sarah's name until our voices were raw. The forest remained stubbornly silent, offering no clues, no answers. By noon, we were forced to accept the horrible truth. Sarah was gone, and we had no idea what had happened to her. We need to get help, Jenny said as we regrouped at our campsite. Hike back to the car, drive to Silver City, call the Rangers. Marcus nodded grimly. We should have done that hours ago. This is beyond us. But as we began breaking down our camp, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Guys, I'm okay. I'm here. Sarah's voice drifted from the tree line, weak but unmistakably hers. We spun toward the sound, and there she was, stumbling out of the forest like a sleepwalker. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair matted with leaves and twigs, but she was alive. Sarah, Jenny screamed, running toward her. Oh God, we thought, where were you? What happened? Sarah swayed on her feet, her eyes unfocused and strange. I don't remember. I woke up about a mile downstream. I think I was sleepwalking. Marcus reached her first, catching her as she nearly collapsed. You're hurt, he said, examining a series of scratches on her arms and face. These look like claw marks. I don't remember, Sarah repeated, and there was something in her voice that made my skin crawl. It was still Sarah's voice, but it lacked the warmth, the personality that made it distinctly hers. It was like listening to a recording of someone trying to imitate her speech patterns. Jenny wrapped her arms around Sarah, tears streaming down her face. We found blood, so much blood. We thought something had killed you. Sarah's response was delayed, as if she had to think about what a normal person would say. I must have cut myself on the rocks. I'm okay now. But she wasn't okay. As we helped her back to our campsite, I noticed the way she moved. Too fluid, too graceful, like she was consciously controlling every muscle. The way she held her head at a slight angle, as if she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. And her eyes. Her eyes were wrong. They were still Sarah's brown eyes, but they seemed deeper somehow. Darker, as if something vast and alien was looking out through them. We should get you to a hospital, Marcus said as we settled her by the fire. You might have a concussion, internal injuries. No, Sarah said quickly, too quickly. I'm fine, just tired. I want to stay and finish our trip. Jenny exchanged a worried glance with Marcus. Sarah, you were missing for almost 12 hours. You don't remember what happened. We need to get you medical attention. I said I'm fine. The sharpness in Sarah's voice made us all flinch. For a moment, something flickered across her features, something cold and predatory. Then she forced another one of those too wide smiles. I mean, I appreciate your concern, but I really am okay. Just a little shaken up. Against our better judgment, we agreed to stay another night. Sarah seemed lucid enough, and she insisted she felt fine. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed about her. She moved differently now, with a predatory grace that seemed at odds with the clumsy, bookish Sarah we knew. She watched us with those dark, knowing eyes, as if she was studying us, learning us. When she thought no one was looking, her expression would go completely blank, like a machine powering down between tasks. But it was the little things that really disturbed me. Sarah had always been left-handed, but now she reached for things with her right hand first, correcting herself only when she noticed our stares. She ate her trail mix methodically, chewing each bite exactly 12 times before swallowing. Sarah had always been a fast, messy eater. And when Jenny mentioned a shared memory from a work party last year, Sarah nodded and smiled, but there was no recognition in her eyes. As evening approached, my unease grew into genuine fear. This wasn't Sarah. I was sure of it now. Something had happened to her out there in the darkness, something that had taken her body and was now wearing it like an ill-fitting costume. The sun set behind the mountains, and the darkness crept in around our small circle of firelight. Sarah sat across from me, staring into the flames with that unsettling intensity, her features sharp and angular in the dancing light. "Tell us what you remember," Jenny said gently. "About last night. Anything might help." Sarah's head tilted to that unnatural angle again. "I remember walking. The trees were calling to me. They had such beautiful voices." "Trees don't have voices, Sarah," Marcus said with forced lightness. "You must have been dreaming." Sarah's smile was cold and empty. "Everything has a voice if you know how to listen. The trees, the stones, the things that live in the spaces between." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jenny scooted closer to the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. "Sarah, you're scaring us," she whispered. "Am I?" Sarah's head swiveled toward Jenny with mechanical precision. "I don't mean to be frightening. I'm still learning how to be human." The last word came out wrong, twisted like she was tasting something foul. That's when I knew for certain. Whatever was sitting across from me wearing Sarah's face and clothes, it wasn't my co-worker. It wasn't even human. Marcus must have realized it too, because I saw his hand slowly reach for the hunting knife on his belt. But the thing that wore Sarah's face was faster, much faster. It moved like liquid shadow, flowing around the fire and tackling Marcus before he could even cry out. They went down in a tangle of limbs, but when they separated, only one of them stood up. Marcus lay motionless in the dirt, his neck bent at an impossible angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the star-filled sky above. Jenny's scream shattered the night air, high and piercing and full of primal terror. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, putting the fire between herself and the thing that had killed Marcus. Sarah straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her clothes with the same mechanical precision she'd shown all day. When she looked at us, her face was a perfect mask of innocence and confusion. "What happened?" she asked in Sarah's voice. "Is Marcus okay? I think he fell." "Get away from us!" Jenny shrieked, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and waving it like a weapon. "What are you? What did you do with Sarah?" The mask slipped. For just a moment, the thing's true face showed through, something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman. Its features shifted and flowed like smoke, revealing glimpses of yellowed fangs, hollow eye sockets, skin like dried leather stretched over prominent bones. Then Sarah's face reasserted itself, though the eyes remained wrong. "I am Sarah," it said, and its voice was layered now, multiple tones speaking in harmony. "I have always been Sarah. I have her memories, her thoughts, her fears. I know that she wet the bed until she was 9. I know that she kissed Jimmy Martinez behind the gym in 7th grade. I know that she cries herself to sleep sometimes, thinking about her mother who died of cancer 3 years ago." Jenny whimpered, the burning branch shaking in her hands. "But you're not her," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You're something else, something that feeds on human flesh and wears their faces." The thing that wore Sarah's body smiled that too wide smile. "I am what your people call skinwalker," it said, "though that is not what I call myself. I am older than your words, older than your species. I have walked these mountains since before the first human drew breath." "What did you do with Sarah?" Jenny demanded, tears streaming down her face. "She is here," the creature said, tapping Sarah's chest with one finger. "Her memories, her personality, her soul, all of it lives inside me now. She is a part of me, as I am part of her. We are one." The fire popped and crackled between us, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent life. The creature began to circle the fire slowly, staying just at the edge of the light. "You taste fear," it continued conversationally. "It makes your blood sweeter, more nourishing. I can smell it on you both, that delicious terror that comes from knowing you are prey." I grabbed Jenny's arm, pulling her to her feet. "We have to run." But the creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Run where? We are 40 miles from the nearest town. There are no roads, no trails you could follow in the dark, and I know these mountains better than you know your own homes." It was right, and we all knew it, but staying meant certain death. "Besides," the creature added, "I'm still learning to be Sarah. I need to study you longer, to understand how she would interact with her friends, how she would mourn for Marcus, how she would comfort you in your final moments." I saw Jenny's grip tighten on the burning branch, saw the desperate calculation in her eyes. She was going to try to fight. Jenny, no, but she was already moving, lunging around the fire with the blazing wood held high like a club. The creature didn't even try to dodge. It caught Jenny's wrist in one hand and twisted sharply. The sound of breaking bones was clearly audible over her scream. The burning branch fell to the ground, and suddenly we were plunged into near-total darkness. Only the dying embers of our campfire provided any illumination, casting everything in hellish red light. I heard Jenny fall, heard her sobbing and gasping in pain. But I couldn't see her in the darkness, couldn't see anything except the creature's eyes, reflecting the firelight like an animal's. "Run," Jenny whispered from somewhere in the darkness. "Mike, run." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush blindly, branches whipping at my face, roots catching my feet. Behind me, I heard Jenny scream one more time, a sound that cut off abruptly in a wet, gurgling noise that would haunt my dreams forever. I had no flashlight, no compass, no idea which direction I was heading. The darkness was absolute, a living thing that seemed to claw at my eyes and fill my lungs. Every step could send me tumbling down a ravine or into a creek bed. Every shadow could hide a tree trunk or a boulder or something far worse. But I kept running, driven by pure animal terror. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. I stumbled and fell a dozen times, each impact sending jolts of pain through my body. But I got up and kept going, because I could hear it behind me, the sound of something large crashing through the forest in pursuit. It wasn't trying to be quiet. It wanted me to hear it coming. I burst out of the tree line onto what felt like a rocky ledge. Moonlight suddenly illuminated the landscape, revealing a narrow canyon stretching out below me. I was standing on the edge of a cliff, maybe 30 feet above the canyon floor. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit had stopped. The forest was silent except for my own ragged breathing and the thundering of my heart. "Michael." Sarah's voice drifted from the darkness behind me, sweet and concerned. "Michael, where are you? I'm hurt. Jenny's hurt. We need your help." I pressed my back against a boulder, trying to control my breathing. It was still trying to play the game, still pretending to be human. "I know you can hear me, Michael. Please, I'm scared. Something attacked us. Something killed Marcus." The voice was getting closer, though I couldn't see anything in the darkness beneath the trees. I managed to fight it off, but Jenny's badly hurt. She needs medical attention. We have to work together if we're going to survive this. It was good, I had to admit. If I hadn't seen it kill Marcus, if I hadn't watched it break Jenny's wrist like a twig, I might have believed it. The concern in Sarah's voice sounded genuine, desperate. "Michael?" The voice was very close now. "I can smell your blood. You're hurt too. Let me help you." A figure emerged from the tree line, Sarah's silhouette in the moonlight moving with that unnatural grace. But something was wrong with her outline. Her limbs seemed too long, too angular, and when she turned her head toward me, it swiveled too far, like an owl's. "There you are," she said, and her voice carried perfectly across the distance between us. I was so worried. She began walking toward me, and with each step, her form seemed to shift and change. Her arms elongated, fingers stretching into claws. Her face remained Sarah's, but her body was becoming something else, something that had never been human. I was trapped on the ledge with nowhere to go but down. 30 feet onto rocks and scree. It would probably kill me, but that might be preferable to what the creature had in mind. "I know what you're thinking," it said, still approaching with that terrible fluid motion. "You're thinking about jumping, but you'll only break your legs, maybe your back. You'll lie there helpless while I feast on you slowly, savoring every scream." It was close enough now that I could see its face clearly in the moonlight. Still Sarah's features, but the skin was too tight, stretched over bones that were the wrong shape. Her smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier," it continued conversationally, "about how I'm still learning to be human. I realize now that I need to understand pain better, how humans experience it, how they respond to it. You're going to help me with that?" I closed my eyes and stepped backward into empty air. The fall seemed to last forever. I had time to think about Sarah, the real Sarah, who had been excited about this trip, who had trusted this place from her childhood. I thought about Marcus and Jenny, who had died because they'd been kind enough to include me in their group. I thought about all the ways this could have gone differently if I just trusted my instincts when something felt wrong. Then I hit the rocks, and everything went white with pain. I woke up to sunlight streaming across my face and the sound of running water nearby. Every part of my body screamed in agony, but I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive. I was lying at the bottom of the canyon beside a narrow creek. My left arm was definitely broken, and my ribs felt like they'd been kicked by a horse, but I could move my legs. Nothing seemed to be paralyzed. Above me, the cliff face rose 30 feet to where I'd jumped. There was no sign of the creature that had worn Sarah's face. It took me 3 days to crawl and stumble my way out of the wilderness. 3 days of agony, drinking creek water and eating huckleberries following the stream because I knew it had to lead somewhere eventually. 3 days of looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Sarah's face grinning at me from the shadows. But it never came. Maybe it had decided I was already dead. Maybe it had found other prey. Or maybe it was waiting, patient as the mountains themselves, for me to return. I made it to a Forest Service road on the 3rd day, where a ranger found me collapsed beside his truck. They airlifted me to the hospital in Silver City, where doctors treated my broken arm and bruised ribs. I told them about my missing friends, about finding their bodies at our campsite. But when the search and rescue teams reached the location I described, they found nothing. No campsite, no bodies, no signs that anyone had ever been there. The blood was gone, Marcus and Jenny were gone. Even our gear had vanished without a trace. The official report listed my 3 friends as missing persons, presumed lost in the wilderness. The ranger who found me suggested I might have suffered head trauma in my fall, that I might be confusing memories of the accident with imagined events. They might be right. Maybe the horror I remember was just the hallucination of a dying brain, starved of oxygen. Maybe Sarah, Marcus, and Jenny are still out there somewhere, lost but alive, waiting for rescue. But I know better. I know what I saw in those dark mountains. I know what hunts in the shadows between the marked trees. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I get phone calls from a number I don't recognize. When I answer, there's just breathing on the other end. Familiar breathing. And then, in a voice I once knew better than my own, someone whispers, "I miss you, Michael. Come back to the mountains. Come back and let me show you how much I've learned about being human." I've changed my number 4 times. It doesn't matter. It always finds me. The doctors say I'm healing well, that the nightmares will fade with time. They've referred me to a therapist who specializes in trauma and survivor's guilt. She's helping me work through what she calls my displacement of responsibility, the tendency to blame supernatural forces for a tragedy that was probably just a series of unfortunate accidents. But she doesn't understand. None of them do. They've never seen what wears human faces in the deep wilderness. They've never looked into eyes that are older than civilization and hungrier than winter. I keep Sarah's photo on my desk at work. The real Sarah, laughing at some joke Marcus had just told, her arm around Jenny's shoulders. I look at it every day and try to remember her as she really was, not as the thing that borrowed her flesh and voice for its own dark purposes. Because somewhere out there in the Gila wilderness, in the shadow of the Mogollon Mountains, something is still learning to be human. It has Sarah's memories now, her knowledge of our world. It knows where I work, where I live, who I care about. And eventually, when it's perfected its disguise, it's going to come looking for me. I think about that cliff every day, about stepping backward into the darkness, about the peace of that moment between the decision and the impact. Sometimes I think I should have aimed for the rocks more carefully, but I'm still here, still alive, still carrying the truth about what happened in those mountains. Maybe that's my purpose now, to remember, to warn, to make sure that when the thing that wears Sarah's face finally comes for me, I'm ready. The marked trees are spreading. I've seen them in other forests now, in other wilderness areas across the Southwest. The same precise cuts, the same dark resin weeping from the bark. Whatever dwells in those mountains is expanding its territory, marking new hunting grounds. And sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full, I can hear them calling to each other across the vast darkness, voices that sound almost human if you don't listen too carefully. I know I should run, should disappear into some anonymous city far from the wilderness. But I can't, because part of me, the part that loved those mountains, that found peace in their ancient silence, is still out there. And until I find a way to get it back, or until the thing that stole it finally comes to collect the rest of me, I'll keep watching the tree line, waiting for Sarah to come home.